Hey guys, tonight we're doing something a little wild. We're going to cram a full 1,000 years of European medieval history into a cosy 2-hour bedtime journey. That's right, the entire Middle Ages, from the ashes of Rome all the way to the whispers of the Renaissance. No, you probably won't survive this. Not with the plagues, invasions, witch trials, and frankly, the hygiene. But you'll come out of it a little smarter, a lot grimier, and hopefully still breathing. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Seriously, I'm not here to trick the algorithm, I'm here to trick your brain into learning something while you fall asleep. Also, where are you watching from tonight? Drop your city and the time in the comments. It's fun knowing where we're all drifting off from, across time zones and centuries. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The story begins in the aftermath of something big, the fall of Rome. It's the year 476, and you're standing in the rubble of what was once the greatest empire the world had known. Marble columns lie broken, aqueducts are crumbling, and the administrative infrastructure that kept everything going has vanished like mist at sunrise. You're not in Rome itself, though. You're somewhere in Western Europe. Let's say you're in a misty village in what will one day be France, but right now it's just damp forested land with a bunch of nervous people and a lot of chickens. People around you talk about the good old days when Roman legions kept roads safe and markets full. Now, warlords roam, trade has collapsed, and literacy is circling the drain. If you know how to read, you're already in the top 1% of brains in Europe, and that's only because a monk taught you. Speaking of monks, welcome to your local monastery. You head over to a squat stone building that smells like beeswax, damp wool, and something vaguely soured. Inside, monks in rough robes shuffle past, muttering prayers under their breath. The scriptorium is where the magic happens. It's dimly lit, and Brother Alric is painstakingly copying out the psalms in Latin by hand. He's been working on the same book for 4 months. No Ctrl-C, no backup copy. Just ink, parchment, and a whole lot of patience. This is how knowledge survives right now. You watch him ink in a little doodle of a bunny in the margins. He says it's to keep the reader awake. Monks are the internet of the early Middle Ages. Slow, limited bandwidth, but crucial. Outside the walls, it's chaos. The people who filled the power vacuum after Rome are what scholars love to call barbarian kingdoms, but they're not as random as they sound. The Franks, the Goths, the Lombards, they're all carving up Europe like a stale loaf of bread. You find yourself at a campfire with a grizzled Frankish warrior who offers you mead and tells stories of fighting for Clovis, a king who just converted to Christianity and is trying really hard to look Roman while being very much not Roman. And here's a fun, weird truth. The people of the early Middle Ages didn't think of themselves as living in the Dark Ages. That term comes later. They saw themselves as struggling to preserve a world that had already been lost. Kind of like trying to reboot a computer with a piece of flint and prayer. Also, spoiler alert, it's not really that dark, it's complicated. There's decline, sure, but there's also resilience. You look around and see people farming, trading, telling stories, building wooden churches, having children and praying a lot. There's fear, but there's also community. And pigs. So many pigs. As the centuries inch forward, you realise something curious. Latin is still the language of learning, but it's mutating. The people outside the monastery gates are speaking early forms of French, Spanish, Italian, what will become the Romance languages. Languages shifting under your feet, like the land after an earthquake. You ask for water in Latin and get a blank stare, but try something like aqua with a peasant accent, and you might just get a cup. Now there's this huge debate among historians. Were the early medieval centuries really a catastrophic collapse, or just a messy transformation? Some argue for dramatic decline, the loss of urban life, literacy, centralised government. Others say it was more of a reorganisation, where power moved from cities to the countryside, and from emperors to local lords and bishops. The quirky side note? Even as the West fell apart, the Eastern Roman Empire, what we now call the Byzantine Empire, just kept on trucking. They still wore purple, still called themselves Romans, and still sent snooty letters to the West like, "Please stop being uncivilized." Back in your own muddy village, though, you're trying not to die from infected splinters. There's no doctor, but there is a wise woman who uses herbs and murmurs spells over your wound. You recover, mostly. People whisper she's a witch, but also, she's the only reason the miller's kid is still alive. It's a weird line between medicine and magic, and no one's entirely sure where it is. Night falls, and the fire crackles. A bard plucks at a lyre and sings tales of Arthur, Roland, and distant lands where giants live in golden castles. You lie back on a bed of straw and itchy wool, watching sparks float into the sky. Life is rough, fragile, but not joyless. You smile, despite the cold, the danger, and the constant threat of someone trying to invade from the next valley over. Tomorrow you're going to learn about feudalism. Lucky you. Morning hits like a slap from a cold fish. The rooster crows far too enthusiastically, and someone's already banging pots outside. You sit up in your straw mattress, back stiff, neck sore, and yes, something just scurried out from under your blanket. Welcome to another glorious day in medieval Europe. No toothpaste, no coffee, and let's hope your latrine trip doesn't involve making eye contact with your neighbour. Today, you're about to understand the invisible force that organises the world around you. Feudalism. It sounds fancy, but it's really just the medieval version of a pyramid scheme. Except instead of vitamin supplements, everyone trades land and loyalty. And at the bottom of that pyramid? You. Probably. Sorry. You head to the fields where the peasants are already hard at work. They're tilling the earth with wooden ploughs, calling out to oxen like grumpy parents late for school drop-off. The land belongs to a local lord, and technically so does your labour. In exchange for a scrap of land and the protection of your noble overlord, translation, not getting raided this week, you owe him several days of free work, a portion of your crops, and maybe a chicken or two during holidays. The lord, of course, lives in a stone manor or a little Motte and Bailey castle on a hill. You've seen him, well, from a distance. Flowing cloak, big hat doesn't do manual labour. He swears loyalty to someone higher up, a duke, maybe even a king. Everyone owes something to someone else, and nobody wants to be caught without a patron when war or famine inevitably rolls through. It's a rigid, tangled web of obligation, oaths and land grants called fiefs. Land is power. There's no money economy to speak of, not yet, so land is how you buy loyalty, status, and a spot in the great medieval Game of Thrones. Your local priest explains it like this. God made the king made the lords protect the peasants, and the peasants grow the food for everyone. It's natural, he says. You nod politely while trying not to cough in his face. That natural part? A theological justification, repeated so often it feels like truth. But deep down you can't help wondering if this whole setup is just a clever way to keep you tied to the soil, literally and spiritually. But not all peasants are created equal. There's a spectrum. Some are free peasants, with a bit more autonomy. Others are serfs, tied to the land like moss to a tree. You can't be sold apart from the land, but you also can't leave. It's a very technical form of being mostly not free. In the manor's courtyard, you watch a legal dispute between two serfs. The local lord acts as judge because why not? He owns the place. One man claims the other stole his pig. The pig is indifferent. The verdict? The thief owes 3 eggs, a day of labour, and a public apology, which includes kissing the pig's snout. Justice, medieval style. Now here's a historical twist. Feudalism isn't actually a universal system. The term was coined much later by historians trying to make sense of this patchwork mess. In reality, local customs varied wildly. Some places had stronger central monarchies, others were ruled more by church officials or tribal traditions. Scholars still argue about whether feudalism was even a thing in the way we imagine it. Was it a formal system? A social metaphor? A lazy way to describe medieval Europe? The jury's still out. That said, the concept is useful, because it helps you understand why everyone is obsessed with loyalty, land, and titles. You can't just decide to be a knight or a noble. You need land, arms, armour, and most importantly, a lord who's willing to back you. The whole society runs on personal relationships, handshakes that double as contracts, and oaths sworn on relics of saints. Quirky fact of the day, some lords got really creative with their fiefs. There are records of land being granted in exchange for unusual services, like supplying a certain number of eels each year, or performing a dance at Christmas in the Lord's Hall. Yes, imagine that being your family's legacy. Ah yes, we're the eel-counting, holiday-dancing vassals of Sir Baldwin the Flatulent. It's a noble tradition. Anyway, you help harvest barley today, because the Lord increased taxes again and the Reeve is watching. The Reeve is the manor's manager, and he has exactly zero sense of humour. You find out he used to be a peasant too, and now lords it over the rest with the enthusiasm of someone who's climbed one rung on a very short ladder. Later, you attend a village feast to celebrate the harvest. There's music, boiled turnips, bad ale, and exactly one roast goose that feeds 20 people. Still, for once, there's laughter. A juggler drops his pins, a drunk mason insists he saw a dragon in the woods, and a miller recites a bawdy poem about a bishop and a sheep. You pretend to be scandalised, but you laugh anyway. You head back to your hut, belly fullish, feet sore. The stars are crisp and bright, and somewhere a dog howls. In your little patch of the feudal world, life trudges on, uneven, often unfair, but strangely communal. You depend on your neighbours for survival, for gossip, for help when the thatch falls off your roof again. In some ways, this interdependence feels cosy. In others, claustrophobic. Tomorrow, you're heading to the castle. Because it's time you saw how the other half, okay, the other 1%, live. You wake up with the rising sun slicing through the cracks in your wooden shutters, illuminating a cosy constellation of dust and hay floating above your head. Your shoulders ache from yesterday's harvest, and your hands are a patchwork of blisters and grime. But today's different. Today, you're heading uphill, to the castle. Not as a guest, of course. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. You're going to deliver a basket of eggs, a slab of salted pork, and 2 unfortunate turnips as part of the Lord's dues. But hey, you'll finally see where the fancy folks live. As you walk the muddy road upward, the castle slowly comes into view, a hulking silhouette of grey stone rising above the village like some grumpy old giant. It's not the Disney kind of castle. There are no glowing towers or symmetrical courtyards. It's squat, damp, and brutally practical. The walls are thick and cold, the towers are full of archers, and the whole place screams, "Come at me, Vikings!" You reach the outer bailey, the open yard between the outer wall and the keep. Livestock wander around, chickens squawk underfoot, and a blacksmith hammers away at a dented helm with a rhythm that would make a bard cry. The air smells like soot, manure, and boiled cabbage. You nod at a guard who barely acknowledges you, and you shuffle toward the kitchens to hand over your goods. Inside the great hall, the lord holds court. He's slouched on a high-backed wooden chair. Not quite a throne, but definitely designed to look impressive. His cloak is embroidered, his beard well-oiled, and his boots fur-lined. It's the middle of summer. The hall is lit by torches and thick windows that barely let in light. Tapestries hang on the stone walls, mostly depicting saints, battles, and one inexplicably smug unicorn. This is the seat of power. Castles aren't just homes, they're military machines, designed to repel sieges, to intimidate enemies, and to control the land around them. You walk the perimeter with a grizzled old guard who talks you through the features: moats, drawbridges, murder holes. Yes, actual holes where defenders pour boiling oil or toss rocks on attackers. Nothing says, "Go away," like flaming pitch, he grins, missing most of his teeth. Inside the keep, which is the innermost part of the castle, things are slightly less filthy. The lord's chambers are lined with rushes that have been freshened with herbs. You still detect a powerful aroma of wet dog and old cheese, but apparently this is what luxury smells like in 1140. A carved wooden bed sits against one wall, draped in heavy blankets and an alarming number of religious icons. A servant scrubs the floor with a rag while muttering what might be a prayer or a curse. You're told that this particular lord once hosted a feast for the local bishop, and they consumed 24 roasted swans in one sitting. You look at your own shoes, which are mostly made of patched sackcloth, and try not to feel too impressed. Power in medieval Europe is visible. It's stitched into cloaks, carved into furniture, layered in armour. Everyone can see it, smell it, and feel its weight. But it's not all feasting and velvet for the upper class. Life here is still dangerous, precarious, and, underneath the show, surprisingly fragile. The castle may be sturdy, but it's also cold, drafty, and a logistical nightmare during a siege. Imagine being trapped inside with 30 other nobles, twice as many servants, and no toilets. You don't want to be on chamber pot duty, trust me. During lunch, which for you is dry bread and a ladle of oniony broth, a young squire tells you about the last siege. The enemy showed up, pitched tents just out of arrow range, and started flinging dead cows over the walls using a trebuchet. Disease spread fast, food ran low, and morale plummeted. "We ate the dogs," he mutters, eyes hollow. You offer him a turnip in solidarity. he accepts with grim gratitude. Now here's a fun fringe detail. Some castles had secret passageways called postern gates, used to sneak out messengers or stage surprise counterattacks. Others had privy chutes, basically poop slides, that exited into the moat, which yes means the moat was often full of literal waste, and yes, sometimes attackers swam through that. War is glamorous like that. You peek into the armoury, where chainmail glints like metallic fish scales, and swords are lined up like obedient children. A knight straps on his gear and grunts as he lifts his helmet. Try running in this for 10 minutes, he scoffs. You try lifting the breastplate and immediately regret it. You've been out-fitnessed by a man whose main diet is boar fat and mead. This knight is part of the Lord's retinue, his private army essentially. In a world without standing national forces, lords rely on their personal warriors. That's why castles matter. They're not just homes, they're power centres, status symbols and miniature fortresses of control. Now scholars love debating the castle culture of the Middle Ages. Were castles primarily military, or did they serve more as administrative hubs? Some argue their construction was more about flexing status than actual defence, since the most effective sieges just involved waiting everyone out. Others point to their strategic placements near roads, rivers and trade routes as proof of their practical use. The truth, as usual, probably sits somewhere in the middle. Evening settles in, and the courtyard is bathed in firelight. Music drifts from the great hall, where nobles are sipping wine and listening to a troubadour sing about love, betrayal, and a tragic fish. You sit near the kitchen fire, gnawing on a charred onion, listening to the hum of voices and the occasional goat bleating from the stables. For all its stone and steel, the castle feels alive, like a great clunky organism with too many legs and not enough bathrooms. Eventually, your errands complete, you head back to your village under a sky full of stars. The castle recedes behind you, a jagged shadow against the horizon. It's built to last, you think, but nothing lasts forever. Tomorrow you'll meet the people who fill those castles with glory, and laundry, the knights. The next morning you're jolted awake by a trumpet. Not a metaphorical one, a literal trumpet echoing across the fields like some medieval alarm clock with strong opinions. A group of mounted figures rides down the hill from the castle, glinting with polished steel, banners fluttering behind them. You rub your eyes, stretch your back and mutter a quiet, heartfelt curse because today you're tagging along with the knights. They trot into the village, hooves clopping in unison, chainmail clinking like a percussion section in a very violent orchestra. These aren't the storybook knights of your bedtime tales. No shining white steeds or perfect jawlines. Their armour is dented, their boots muddy, and one of them is clearly nursing a hangover under his helmet. Still, there's a weight to them. They ride like they own the road, which, to be fair, they sort of do. You're assigned to help with their gear, which is like being told to carry the wardrobe of a walking tank. You heft a hauberk, a chainmail shirt weighing about 30 pounds, and nearly dislocate your spine. It smells like sweat, rust, and whatever medieval laundry soap was made of, you suspect soap is a generous term here. One knight lets you hold his greatsword, a 6-foot slab of death that you immediately drop. "Careful," he growls, "that's how we solve land disputes." Before long, the troop rides out to practice in a nearby field. You follow on foot trying to keep up, shoes squelching in the mud. The jousting begins, knights charging at each other with lances, aiming for shields, helmets and occasionally dignity. One poor guy gets knocked clean off his horse and lands in a goose pond. Everyone laughs, including him. Honour matters, but laughter heals bruises faster. Being a knight looks glamorous until you spend a day watching them train. They spar endlessly, drill formation charges, and run obstacle courses in full armour. You watch one knight climb onto a horse while wearing 60 pounds of gear, and you're honestly more impressed by that than anything else. Your legs hurt just watching. But knighthood isn't just about stabbing things, it's also about chivalry. Or so the poets claim. One of the squires, a snarky teenager with ink-stained fingers, explains the code. Bravery, loyalty, defending the weak, and respecting women. Unless those women are witches or peasants or from the wrong kingdom, in which case, rules are flexible. It's more like a guideline, he says, shrugging. Knights are expected to be virtuous, but also to enforce their lord's will, collect taxes, and occasionally burn down someone's barn if they refuse to pay. It's a weird moral landscape where you can attend mass in the morning, ride out to enforce a grain tithe by lunchtime, and return to flirt with a noble lady by evening. You're starting to see that chivalry is more branding than behaviour. There's a debate that still echoes in scholarly circles. Was chivalry a genuine ethical code, or a clever PR stunt by the ruling class to justify their monopoly on violence? Some argue that the idea of the noble knight was crafted by churchmen and poets to rein in war-happy lords. Others think knights actually tried to live by these ideals. When it was convenient, maybe it's both. You sit by the fire with a weathered knight named Sir Talon, who has more scars than teeth. He tells you about the time he fought in the Crusades, though he's vague on which one. Too many deserts, he mutters, and not enough water. His stories blur together: holy relics, treacherous allies, sandstorms, and a Saracen who stole his boots. He still curses him to this day. And now for your weird fact of the day. Not all knights were men. Yeah. Occasionally a woman would take up arms and ride to war, often in disguise or with noble permission. There are records, patchy, debated, and sometimes romanticized, of female knights or warrior women holding castles and commanding troops. They're the exception, not the rule, but they existed. Which gives you something to think about as you sharpen a lance and try not to poke your own foot. You learn that becoming a knight starts young. Boys from noble families are sent off at age 7 as pages, trained in manners, letters, and how not to trip over their own tunics. At 14, they become squires, apprenticed to a knight, polishing armour, grooming horses, and getting yelled at a lot. If they survive long enough without impaling themselves, they're knighted, usually after proving themselves in battle or at a tournament, or occasionally through the much less glamorous method of inheritance and bribes. Later that day, a knight challenges another to a mock duel. It starts civil, bows, declarations, a crowd gathered, but quickly descends into a chaotic blur of fists, steel, and very undignified grunting. You duck as a helmet goes flying past your head. When it's over, both men are bruised, one has a sprained wrist, and the rest are drunk on victory, and probably actual ale. We fight, one explains, because it reminds us we're still alive. That and someone insulted his horse. You spend the evening helping the squires clean gear. It takes hours. You scrub dried mud, oil leather, and try to unbend a dented shield with a hammer and 0 upper body strength. You hear stories whispered among the squires, of knights who betrayed their lords, of ghostly warriors seen on battlefields, of orders like the Templars who supposedly guard secret relics. You wonder how much is real, and how much is just boredom spun into bedtime tales. As darkness falls, you sit under the stars beside a dozing warhorse, your body aching in places you didn't know existed. The campfire crackles. Someone plays a lute badly. For all its blood and bravado, knighthood is also about endurance. They train endlessly, live under pressure, and die young more often than not. You lie back on the grass, eyes heavy, ears filled with the soft clink of chainmail and snoring. You've survived a day among knights, and honestly, you're not sure you'd want to do it again. Glory is exhausting. Tomorrow you'll find some peace, at least you hope, inside the quiet walls of a monastery. You wake before the sun, the sky still a hazy grey smear, the air damp and earthy. A rooster crows somewhere in the distance, and for once, it doesn't feel aggressive. Today, there's no clang of swords or thudding hooves. Instead, you're headed somewhere quieter, more introspective, and frankly, less likely to involve being accidentally stabbed by someone showing off. You're going to the monastery. The path winds uphill through fields and mist, your boots kicking dew off the grass. Eventually you see it, a squat cluster of stone buildings behind a simple wall, surrounded by gardens, trees, and a level of silence that almost feels suspicious. This place is a Benedictine monastery, a self-contained world of prayer, work, and books, basically the medieval version of logging off social media forever. You're greeted at the gate by a sleepy-looking novice who barely says a word, just nods and gestures you inside. Within, the monastery is a blend of chilly stone and soft incense. Everything echoes, footsteps, whispers, even the creak of a door feels like a thunderclap. The walls are undecorated, the floors swept, the air filled with the faint sound of chanting from the chapel. There's a rhythm here, a schedule older than you, older than most kings, older than the idea of Western Europe itself. Your guide, Brother Airdrick, has been a monk for 22 years. He walks barefoot, speaks in a low melodic voice, and refers to you as my child, which is only slightly creepy. He tells you about the rule of St. Benedict, the guiding text for monks like him. It's all about balance, ora et labora, prayer and work. There are no knights, no politics, officially, and no nonsense. Life here is structured down to the minute, and it starts way too early. The bell rings, matins. It's the first of 8 daily prayer sessions. You shuffle into the chapel, which is lit only by flickering candles. The chanting begins, low, droning Latin that vibrates in your chest and makes your eyes water, either from the smoke or the sudden overwhelming sense that you might be closer to God than you intended. You don't understand the words, but the feeling, it's weirdly calming. After the service, the monks split off into their assigned tasks. Some head to the fields, others to the kitchens, and a lucky few to the scriptorium, the sacred realm of book copying. You follow Brother Edric there, your breath fogging in the cold morning air. The scriptorium smells like ink, dust, and dried parchment. It's one of the most important rooms in the entire monastery, maybe in all of Europe. Inside, monks sit hunched over wooden desks, meticulously copying texts by hand. And not just Bibles, though there are plenty of those. You spot pages from Aristotle, Roman law, herbal medicine guides, and something that looks suspiciously like a bestiary featuring a lion with 6 heads. Margins are decorated with swirls, vines, and the occasional weird little doodle. A knight fighting a snail, a rabbit riding a dog, or a nun fighting a demon with a spoon. You stare. Brother Edric shrugs. Even the holiest minds need to stretch, he says. Here's the historical truth. Monasteries preserved knowledge. After Rome's collapse, when literacy shrank faster than your attention span during a long sermon, monasteries became the memory banks of Europe. They preserved texts, translated ancient works, and produced new theology, philosophy, and even science. Were they biased? Oh, absolutely. Most scribes didn't bother copying anything that didn't glorify God or fall in line with Christian morals. But still, without them, half of what we know about ancient Greece and Rome would have vanished. You spend an hour trying to copy a sentence in Latin using a quill. You smear ink on your face, your hands, the desk, and possibly the monk next to you. He doesn't react. You suspect he's achieved inner peace, or just resigned to chaos. After a frugal lunch of lentils, stale bread, and a very suspicious turnip, you head to the herb garden, where a monk named Brother Cedric talks your ear off about medicinal plants. He shows you wormwood, sage, and something called monk's pepper, which he swears helps with unclean thoughts. He winks. You inch away. He also hands you a salve that smells like rotting tree bark and insists it will draw out the bad humours. You nod politely and wait until he's not looking before discreetly wiping it off on a bush. Later you sneak off to the library, a dim room lined with thick wooden shelves and chained books. Yes, chained. Manuscripts are rare, expensive, and copied by hand over months or even years. The chains keep them from wandering off with curious visitors like you. You spot a volume on saints' miracles, a list of comets interpreted as divine warnings, and something that looks suspiciously astrological, though it's hidden behind a psalter. A quiet rebellion. You sit on a bench and listen to the afternoon bells. In this cloistered world, time moves differently. The monks rarely leave the grounds, and many don't want to. This life, monastic life, isn't punishment. For them, it's the purest way to serve God. Simplicity, obedience, silence. Though, you notice quite a bit of passive-aggressive muttering during kitchen duty. There's a scholarly debate that hums under the surface of your experience. Were monasteries truly isolated, or were they more connected to the world than we imagine? Some historians argue they were sanctuaries from the chaos of medieval life. Others point to their role in land ownership, political influence, and even warfare. After all, many abbots wielded more power than local lords, and some monasteries had armies. Brother Edric says they just happened to own a few dozen farms and influence regional tax policy, by God's will. As the day fades into evening, you return to the chapel for Compline, the final prayer before bed. The chanting begins again, now softer, slower. Candlelight flickers along the worn stone walls, casting long shadows that dance like medieval ghosts. You breathe in the quiet, the stillness, the feeling of time stretching out like an endless scroll. You're given a simple cot in the guest quarters. The mattress is straw, the blanket is coarse wool, and the pillow is aggressively honest about its lack of stuffing. But you're warm, you're safe, and for once you're clean. As you drift off to sleep, you realise something strange. This has been the most peaceful day you've had since arriving in medieval Europe. No shouting, no swords, no flaming arrows, just chanting, ink stains, and monks arguing over how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. Tomorrow, unfortunately, peace ends, because tomorrow the Vikings arrive. You wake to the sound of bells, not the gentle meditative tolls of prayer from yesterday, but frantic clanging bells that scream panic. You sit up in your scratchy cot, heart already pounding. Outside, the peaceful world of the monastery has turned upside down. Monks sprint past your window, robes flapping, and someone yells, "To the chapel! Get the relics!" You don't know what's happening, but when people start grabbing bones of saints and running for the hills, you follow. Smoke is already curling in the sky by the time you reach the outer courtyard. A lookout points toward the river, and there, cutting through the morning mist, are the unmistakable shapes of longships. Vikings. Long, narrow boats with carved dragon heads, sails the colour of dried blood, and warriors packed in like angry sardines. They're rowing with a terrifying calm, like they've done this 100 times, which they have. You blink. One moment, you are copying psalms and making herbal tea, and the next you're watching a group of very determined men with axes beach their boats and leap into your world like it's a buffet. The Viking Age hit Europe like a thunderclap around the late 700s and didn't let up for almost 300 years. To you, it's sudden and terrifying. But for the monks, especially those living near rivers or coasts, this is just Tuesday. You're told the monastery's been raided before, and though it's inland, the nearby river feeds into the sea. The longships come fast and leave faster, often before anyone with a sword can even get their boots on. You duck behind a barrel as shouting breaks out and steel clashes with wood. A few of the local guards, those not already running, try to stand their ground, but they're outnumbered and, frankly, out-Vikinged. You catch sight of one raider charging toward the scriptorium with a wild grin and a torch. That building, full of painstakingly copied manuscripts, is probably toast by now. Here's a harsh reality. Monasteries were prime targets. They had gold, silver chalices, bejewelled crosses, and best of all, no real defences. The Viking raiders weren't dumb. They knew exactly where the soft underbelly of Christian Europe was, and they jabbed it repeatedly. You scramble with the monks to a hidden storage room clutching a heavy wooden chest containing relics of some obscure saint you've never heard of. Brother Edric, wheezing as he runs, mutters prayers between gasps. "This is divine punishment," he says. "We forgot humility." You're pretty sure this is less about humility and more about bad location choices. The Vikings loot fast. They take chalices, burn scrolls, slaughter livestock, and, thankfully, don't kill as many people as they could. This particular group seems more interested in profit than blood. You spot one carefully tucking a gilded Bible into a sack like it's going on eBay. Then, as quickly as they came, they're gone, vanishing down the river with their boats loaded and your monastery smouldering. You help the monks put out fires, salvage what books you can, and bury the few dead in hastily dug graves. The mood is grim but unsurprised. This isn't the first time, it won't be the last. One of the younger monks, eyes rimmed red, tells you about Lindisfarne, an English monastery raided in 793. That attack is often marked as the beginning of the Viking Age. The terror spread like wildfire after that. The Northmen, the monk whispers, they sail like ghosts. You learn the Vikings weren't a single people but a mix of Scandinavian raiders, traders and settlers, mostly from modern-day Norway, Sweden and Denmark. They weren't always bloodthirsty maniacs, though that's the version the monks prefer. Sometimes they came to trade, to settle, even to marry into local families. But today was definitely the pillaging kind of visit. Later, as the monks gather what's left of their lives, you sit with Brother Cedric in the ruined herb garden. He says something you didn't expect. Some of them convert, you know. They build churches now in Normandy and Ireland. One came back and gave a silver as apology. You blink. Vikings? Giving apologies? There's a debate among historians about how to define the Viking influence. Were they destroyers, or were they catalysts for change? They certainly destabilized parts of Europe, but they also helped forge new alliances, trade networks, and even kingdoms. The Normans, for example, those fancy castle-building folks in France, were originally Vikings who settled, converted to Christianity, and basically became the aristocratic equivalent of rebranded software. And the weird historical fact of the day, Vikings didn't wear horned helmets. That image came from 19th century opera costumes. Real Viking helmets were mostly conical, practical, and tragically unhorned. Sorry to ruin your Halloween costume. As night falls, the monastery smells like wet ash and singed parchment, but life resumes. The monks begin evening prayers, this time in a half-burned chapel. The chanting sounds hoarser now, more ragged, but no less sincere. You sit quietly in the back, smoke-stained and exhausted, listening to voices rise through a broken roof toward the stars. Tomorrow you'll travel to meet a man who tried to bring order to all this chaos. A king, a legend, a man named Charlemagne. You leave the charred monastery behind at dawn, the air still thick with the scent of ash and scorched manuscripts. Your boots squish in damp grass as you head east across the rolling countryside, guided by rumours and an invitation scrawled on the back of a merchant's wine invoice. The name is one you've heard whispered in reverent tones. Charlemagne, King of the Franks, Emperor of the Romans, the guy with the crown, the sword, and apparently the sheer audacity to try gluing the shattered pieces of Western Europe back together. You're going to meet him, or at least see what his world looks like. Your journey takes days, through thick forests echoing with bird calls and the occasional suspicious rustle, across wide rivers, where ferrymen eye your shoes and try to charge you a mud tax, and into towns where Latin is spoken with a Frankish twist, and everyone seems to be building something. Roads, bridges, churches, even a school. It feels oddly organised, like someone somewhere made a giant to-do list for an entire continent. Eventually you reach Aachen, Charlemagne's favoured capital, and by capital, you're really talking about a royal complex surrounded by what's still mostly a muddy settlement. Europe doesn't really do cities at this point, not in the Roman sense, but Aachen has ambition. Stone buildings rise where wood used to stand. The centrepiece, a shining octagonal chapel that looks like someone dragged a slice of Constantinople into the forests of Germany. Charlemagne apparently has a taste for imperial flair. You arrive just in time for a royal audience, and while you don't get to shake hands with the big man himself, security is understandably tight. You do glimpse him, broad-shouldered, white-bearded, wrapped in a robe that looks suspiciously Roman. He's seated on a stone throne, raised slightly above the crowd, yet oddly plain. No gold, no jewels, just rough stone and a sense of permanence. It's the throne of a man who wants power, but also wants to seem like he's above wanting power. Charlemagne's rule is a pivot point for the entire medieval project. He begins as King of the Franks, a tribe that somehow transitions from Germanic warbands to something resembling a state. But Charlemagne's ambitions are bigger than borders. He fights constantly against Saxons, Lombards, Moors, expanding his territory like it's a strategy board game. At his peak he controls most of Western Europe, from the Pyrenees to the Elbe, and then comes the real moment. Christmas Day, 800 AD, when he's crowned emperor by the Pope in Rome. You've heard the story already from 3 monks and a wine-soaked scholar. He kneels to pray, the Pope slips the crown on and boom, he's Emperor of the Romans. Not Holy Roman Emperor yet, that branding comes later, but still, a bombshell move. It's as if the ghost of the Roman Empire gasps and sits up in bed, mumbling, "Wait, we're doing this again?" You talk to a palace scholar named Einhard, who's suspiciously well-informed and very enthusiastic about Charlemagne's reforms. He's bringing learning back, he says, eyes gleaming behind round spectacles. He's ordered the schools to teach grammar, rhetoric, astronomy, even handwriting. You should see the new script, Carolingian minuscule. It's beautiful, legible, revolutionary. You nod, mostly because you're impressed that people are this excited about font design. It's true, though. Charlemagne pushes for a renaissance. Not the big Italian one you already know, but a smaller, earlier burst of intellectual revival. He gathers scholars from all over, Alcuin of York, Theodulf of Orleans, guys with names that sound like spell components. They collect texts, standardise Latin, and try to teach clergymen to read so sermons stop sounding like drunk poetry slams. This is a weird moment in Europe's story, brutal and brilliant all at once. Charlemagne executes 4,500 rebellious Saxons in one day, but also funds schools for peasant boys. He's illiterate for most of his life, but surrounds himself with books. He wants to be Caesar, David, and Constantine all rolled into one, and somehow, for a while, he pulls it off. You sit in the back of the chapel during Vespers, admiring the architecture. The ceiling mosaics glitter with gold, and the floor's a geometric puzzle of polished stones. Roman columns stand awkwardly next to Frankish stonework, like two time periods forced to room together in college. It's beautiful, but slightly unhinged. Later you're invited to a modest feast: roasted duck, honey-glazed vegetables, and a surprisingly good spiced wine. The nobles speak Latin with heavy accents, and everyone keeps glancing toward the dais where Charlemagne dines. He doesn't laugh often, but when he does, the whole room follows suit like it's been programmed to. Power has gravity, and this man, he bends everything around him. Now here's a scholarly debate that still makes historians argue over dinner. Was Charlemagne's empire a real revival of Rome, or just a well-branded Frankish kingdom? Some say his coronation created a new Western Empire, a spiritual successor to Caesar and Augustus. Others argue it was mostly for show, that the real power stayed regional, and Charlemagne was more of a warlord with a particularly aggressive PR team. And here's your quirky detail of the day: Charlemagne had a pet elephant. No, seriously. A gift from the Abbasid Caliph Harun al-Rashid, shipped all the way from Baghdad to Aachen. His name was Abul Abbas, and he was apparently well liked until he died of a cold in what is now Germany. Because of course a Middle Eastern elephant doesn't do well in a damp Rhineland winter. You step outside after the feast and look up at the stars, your mind swirling with contradictions. This empire is huge and fragile, enlightened and brutal, a high point, but also the beginning of a long, slow unravelling. Because when Charlemagne dies, the whole thing starts to wobble. His empire will split among his sons and grandsons like a loaf of bread at a family dinner where everyone brings knives. But for now, standing in the chill wind outside a chapel built by a king who dreamed of becoming a new Caesar, it feels like maybe, just maybe, Europe has pulled itself together. Tomorrow you'll find out how fast things fall apart again, because you're going on crusade. You leave Aachen behind under a bruised sky, the imperial roads slowly giving way to rougher trails, chatter turning from Latin to the guttural rhythms of dozens of local dialects. The empire that Charlemagne tried to knit together is already starting to fray at the seams. But you're heading east now, east and south, toward a different kind of fire. Word has spread through the towns and villages. There's a call from the Pope, a promise of salvation, and a chance to die very far from home. You're about to join the chaos of the Crusades. The year is 1096, give or take a few confusing calendars. Europe is simmering, lords squabble, knights get bored between feuds, peasants still pray for rain and dread the next tax. But something new cuts through the noise, a sermon shouted from a pulpit in France. Pope Urban II has announced that Jerusalem is in danger, and anyone who takes up the cross to fight for it will have their sins forgiven. Immediate, automatic, platinum-tier salvation. For people constantly terrified of hellfire, this is basically a holy cheat code. You find yourself swept up in the first waves of pilgrims and warriors. Some are armoured knights with banners and baggage trains. Others are barefoot peasants who packed a sausage and nothing else. There's one guy carrying a wooden cross on his back like he's auditioning for sainthood. Another claims he had a dream that God told him to bring his pet goat to the Holy Land. You keep your distance from that one. The roads are crowded and dangerous. Supply chains are a joke. People starve, get robbed, or just wander off. You hear about Peter the Hermit, a wild-eyed preacher who led thousands of poor crusaders ahead of the official armies. Most of them never even made it to Constantinople. Ambushed, massacred, sold into slavery. It's less a crusade and more a rolling disaster with enthusiastic branding. By the time you reach Byzantine lands, everything changes. The roads are smoother, the city's richer, and suddenly people are wearing silk instead of burlap. You pass through Constantinople, the great city that outlived Rome and still shines with gold-tipped domes and mosaics that make your eyes ache. The emperor, Alexios Komnenos, welcomes the Crusaders with the same energy you use when someone brings 5 angry relatives to crash on your couch. You're an ally, technically. Mostly you're a liability. Eventually the crusading armies cross into Asia Minor and things get real very quickly. The Seljuk Turks are not thrilled to see you. Battles are chaotic, marches are long and punishing. You run out of water. Someone steals your shoes. You share a tent with a knight who only bathes on St. Michael's Day. But through some combination of zeal, desperation and tactical luck, the First Crusade keeps grinding forward. And then, somehow, miraculously you reach Jerusalem. It's 1099. The city glows in the desert sun like a holy mirage. The siege lasts for weeks. Disease, starvation, infighting, and then finally the walls are breached. What follows is not noble, not holy. the massacre of Jerusalem becomes one of the darkest stains on the entire crusading effort. Men, women, children, slaughtered in the streets. Some chroniclers say the blood ran ankle deep. Others say that's poetic exaggeration. You're not sure, but you've seen enough to know that holiness does not survive prolonged exposure to war. The Crusader states are carved out in the Levant like slices of unfamiliar pie. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch. Western knights try to rule over Eastern lands, often cluelessly. Languages clash, cultures mix, violently and awkwardly. Some try diplomacy, others try the sword. You meet a Templar who talks about defending pilgrims, but also seems disturbingly fond of beheadings. It's all very unclear whether this is God's work or just medieval colonisation with a shinier label. Back in Europe, word spreads like wildfire. Jerusalem is liberated. Crusading becomes a cultural phenomenon. Songs, sermons, plays, all glorifying the Holy War. Every lord with a younger son suddenly sees the East as a solution to their inheritance problems. More crusades follow. The Second Crusade stumbles, the Third brings out the big names, Richard the Lionheart, Saladin, Frederick Barbarossa, who famously drowns in a river, before he even gets to fight. It becomes a revolving door of ambition, piety, and bad decision-making. Here's the strange part. Despite all the violence, the crusading world is also a place of cross-cultural exchange. You see Arabic science, medicine, mathematics filtering into Europe, astrolabes, surgical tools, translations of Greek texts that had vanished from the West. You hear songs in multiple languages, see spices and fabrics you've never imagined. War opens doors, whether anyone wants it to or not. And here's your quirky fact of the day. During one of the Crusades, a group of French knights got so lost they ended up in what is now Portugal, assumed it was the Holy Land, fought some Moors, and declared victory. Then they went home, utterly unaware they never reached the actual Middle East. That's right. Medieval GPS, still under development. There's also a huge debate among scholars today about the true motivation behind the Crusades. Was it religious fervour? Greed? Political ambition? A genuine desire to protect pilgrims and relics? The answer, as usual, is all of the above. Crusading became a brand, an institution. Later popes would offer crusading indulgences for fighting in Spain, or even against other Christians during events like the Albigensian Crusade. The idea morphed. The violence remained. Eventually you make your way back to Europe, older, dirtier, and carrying more emotional baggage than any relic. You've seen holy cities bathed in blood, and children holding swords taller than themselves. You've watched bishops bless slaughter and kings forget why they were even fighting. But you've also seen ideas and inventions cross borders, languages mix, and cultures collide in ways that change the shape of Europe. You arrive back home just in time for the markets to open and the towns to swell. Turns out, while you were off fighting for salvation, the cities were waking up. Tomorrow you'll dive into the noise, colour and pungent aroma of a medieval town. You step through the creaking wooden gates of a medieval town, and the first thing that hits you isn't the noise or the shouting or the bell tolling in the distance. It's the smell. An aggressively enthusiastic blend of sweat, fish, dung and day-old beer, spiked with a generous pinch of human ambition. If the countryside was slow and solemn, and the Crusades were chaotic and bloody, this is where life gets loud, fast and weirdly pungent. The streets are narrow and winding, more like goat paths that grew up and started charging taxes. Buildings lean precariously over the alleys, like they're eavesdropping on the gossip below. And gossip, by the way, is thriving. Every open window has a pair of elbows sticking out and a running commentary on whose daughter was seen at the baker's stall wearing last year's smock. It's like a live-action social network, minus the filters. You're in 13th century Bruges, a bustling, muddy hub of trade and chatter, where cobblers and butchers rub shoulders with fishmongers, innkeepers, and that one guy with no job who just really enjoys shouting at things. The town is ringed by walls and towers, mostly to keep out raiders, bandits, and other towns pretending to be offended by your superior brewing skills. Inside, it's a kaleidoscope of colours, smells, languages, and surprisingly well-dressed pigeons. You pass market stalls groaning under heaps of produce, cheese wheels the size of wagon wheels, and bread so dense it could double as a weapon. Sellers scream deals over one another while waving wildly at potential buyers. A boy tries to sell you a turnip with no worms this time, and you consider it, until a woman with 5 missing teeth grabs it first and glares like she'd duel you for it. The town square is the beating heart of it all. There's a cathedral going up, or halfway up, scaffolding crawling with stonemasons shouting in thick Flemish. It's been under construction for years, and no one expects it to be done in their lifetime. A juggler is performing in front of a tavern. A man with a lute is singing a ballad about a nun, a chicken, and a bishop's horse. No one really understands it, but the chorus slaps. Life here is raw, vivid, unpredictable. You duck into a tavern, and it's like stepping into someone's sweaty fever dream. The air is thick with smoke, music, and mead. Merchants argue over wool prices while a group of students tries to compose a poem using only obscene gestures. A woman with arms like hams is arm wrestling a bald man, and the loser apparently buys the next round. You sit down, sip something warm and brown, and try not to think too hard about what it is. Despite the noise and grime, there's an energy here that you didn't feel in the feudal villages. This place hums with opportunity. People come here to sell, to learn, to escape. If you can work, hustle, or fake it well enough, there's a chance to carve out a life that isn't entirely dictated by a lord or a bishop. Towns are messy and dangerous and smelly, but they're also liberating. And here's something wild. Some towns were so independent they bought or won charters, legal documents that gave them the right to govern themselves. Towns with charters had elected councils, their own courts, even their own taxes. The idea that a bunch of butchers and bakers could decide how to run things, that's practically revolutionary in a world still tangled in feudal chains. But it's not all independence and self-rule. There are guilds, and you're about to get a crash course in just how powerful and petty they can be. You meet a young apprentice sweating in a smithy, hammering horseshoes while his master glares at you for distracting the help. Every trade has a guild: shoemakers, weavers, masons, tanners. The guild controls who gets to work, what they charge, and how they dress. No joke, some guilds have strict dress codes. There's a reason the candle makers wear blue. You ask how to join a guild and are promptly laughed at. You'd need to spend 7 years as an apprentice, living with a master, doing every dirty task imaginable, then move up to journeyman status, where you'd travel, work, and finally submit a masterpiece, a literal handmade proof of your skill, to gain full membership. Basically, it's medieval hazing with more woodworking. As you wander through the textile district, you realise this town, this economic engine, is built on trade. You see Italian coins, Arabic glassware, Eastern spices, and cloth dyed so richly it looks like liquid rubies. Everything is moving. Goods, people, ideas. You spot a Jewish merchant discussing grain prices with a Christian tanner. Later, you hear an argument in French between a moneylender and a local lord. These towns are Europe in miniature, buzzing with contradictions and potential. But towns come with danger too. Fires break out constantly. Half the buildings are wood, and people think candles are indoor lighting. Disease spreads fast in the close quarters. You step over a suspicious puddle, then realise someone's tossing waste from an upper window. You now understand why so many medieval hats have brims. And then there's crime. You witness a purse snatching near the butcher's stall and chase the thief for half a block before losing him in an alley that smells like regret. You mention it to a city guard, who shrugs and says, "That's why I tie mine to my belt." Justice is inconsistent. Here's your quirky fact of the day. Some towns had town criers who read official announcements aloud, and also served as human lost and founds. Lose your dog? Tell the crier. They'd literally yell, "Brown dog, missing tail, answers to peasant." Reward, 2 onions. And here's the scholarly debate. Did towns truly represent freedom and progress? Or were they just another layer of hierarchy and control? Some historians paint them as beacons of emerging capitalism and civic liberty. Others argue they were exclusive, corrupt, and riddled with class tensions. After all, try starting your own business without guild approval, and see how fast your shop accidentally burns down. Night falls, and the town changes. Lanterns flicker, taverns swell, and shadows stretch long in the alleys. Music echoes down the streets, punctuated by laughter, arguing, and the occasional donkey. You buy a meat pie that may or may not contain meat, and sit on a low wall watching the life pulse around you. Tomorrow everything changes again, because tomorrow the air starts to smell different. Tomorrow the plague comes. It starts with a rumour, a whisper at the market low enough that it barely reaches your ears over the sound of someone trying to sell half a cabbage. A merchant from the south says something strange is happening near the ports. People dying, whole villages quiet. Rats, someone mutters. Ships, something from the east. You keep walking, not thinking much of it. Towns are always full of rumours. Most of them are nonsense. This one isn't. A week later, the Black Death arrives. It doesn't knock. It kicks the door in. At first, it's just the smell that changes. Not the usual stew of fish, sweat, and overconfident cheese, but something sharp, metallic. The kind of scent that lingers in your nose and makes your stomach tighten. Then come the bodies. 1, then 3, then a dozen, then too many to count. People die quickly. You see a man laughing at a joke one morning and being carried off in a cart that same evening, stiff and blotched with bruises the size of apples. The symptoms are unmistakable. Fever, vomiting, swelling in the armpits, neck, and groin. Buboes, they're called. Black, painful lumps that stink of death. You see a child clutching his mother, both covered in them, both gone by sunrise. You try not to look anymore, but it's impossible to ignore. The panic sets in fast. The church bells never stop ringing. Burials happen around the clock, and when the graveyards fill, the dead are dumped in pits stacked like firewood. Mass graves appear at the edge of town, dug by men who drink to forget what they're doing. You help once, just once. The silence of the bodies haunts your dreams. Markets empty. Guilds collapse. No one wants to touch money, much less each other. The taverns close, something you didn't think was even possible. People refuse to share food, beds, or even eye contact. Families abandon their own, locking sick loved ones in rooms and nailing the doors shut. You pass one house with red paint smeared on the door. Inside, you can hear coughing. Doctors show up eventually wearing strange bird-like masks stuffed with herbs and flowers. Plague doctors, they call them. They wave incense, recite prayers, and suggest treatments like bloodletting or bathing in vinegar. None of it works. If anything, it makes things worse. The plague doesn't care about your education or your herbs. It spreads by touch, by breath, by flea, by rat. Especially rats who thrive in towns like this, full of open trash heaps and cosy wooden attics. And yet, no one really understands the cause. Not truly. Some say it's the Jews, an accusation that spreads like fire. Pogroms erupt across Europe. In one town you hear about a mob that burned an entire Jewish quarter overnight. Later someone whispers that it was poisoned wells, or bad air, or divine punishment. God is angry, says the local priest, who now sleeps in the church and hasn't bathed in weeks. He also believes sneezing too hard might summon demons. You're starting to tune him out. A group of religious fanatics passes through town. Flagellants, they call themselves. Dozens of barefoot men and women, shirtless, bleeding, singing hymns, and whipping themselves in the streets. They believe that suffering will cleanse humanity. People cheer. Some join in. Others watch from windows. You just stand there, too tired to feel anything. Here's your twisted fun fact of the day. The plague wasn't one disease. It was multiple outbreaks, hitting Europe in waves from the late 1340s to the 1350s and beyond. The most infamous wave arrived in 1347, carried by ships from the Black Sea, reaching Sicily and then climbing through Italy, France, Germany, England. It killed, depending on whose estimate you believe, anywhere from a third to half of Europe's population. That's right, 1 out of every 2 people, gone, vanished, not in a century, in a few short, brutal years. The death toll isn't just physical, it's cultural. Entire monasteries vanish, all the monks inside wiped out. Fields go untended, livestock die in pens, roads fall silent. Nobles, peasants, merchants, children, death doesn't discriminate. Whole villages are left empty, nature creeping back in like it's reclaiming the earth. Forests grow where wheat once waved, wolves return. And this brings us to one of the biggest scholarly debates. Did the Black Death destroy medieval society, or transform it? Some historians see it as the death knell of feudalism, breaking the system by making labour scarce and peasants suddenly valuable. Others argue that the social changes were already underway, and the plague just pressed fast forward. Either way, everything feels different after it. You notice it too. Wages rise for those who survive. Landowners panic, offering better terms just to keep workers. Guilds bend their rigid rules, letting in new blood. The church, once unquestioned, now looks fractured. How can a loving God allow this? Why do priests die as fast as beggars? Some turn to mysticism, others to skepticism. You meet one man who's given up entirely and now worships the moon, which feels excessive, but honestly, who's judging? Eventually the plague burns out, or at least slows down. The town begins to breathe again. Markets reopen. Bells toll for weddings instead of burials. Children play in the streets, as if nothing happened, but the scar is deep. You walk past a row of houses and realise that only 2 are still occupied. You sleep in a bed that once belonged to someone you knew, and every creak of the wood feels like a ghost remembering its last breath. But in the weirdest, most morbid twist, life feels sharper now. People drink more, laugh louder, love faster. There's a kind of feverish hunger in everything they do, like they've all seen the edge and now sprint away from it with every heartbeat. You feel it too. Tomorrow you'll see what fear does when it doesn't burn out, but festers instead. Because next, you're heading into a world of witches, omens, and heretics. You'd think that after watching half the population vanish into plague pits, people would be a little more chill. Maybe sit around, reflect, make peace with their mortality, get into hobbies like embroidery or baking. But no. Instead, they do what terrified people have always done when the world stops making sense. They start looking for someone to blame. You find yourself in a village nestled against the edge of a dark forest, because of course it is, where the locals are whispering about a woman named Alba, who lives alone, collects herbs, and once stared at a pig until it got sick. That's basically 3 strikes in medieval Europe. You tag along with the villagers as they shuffle nervously toward her hut, torches in hand and logic left firmly behind. It doesn't take long for fear to boil over. By sunset, Alba is in the stocks, accused of witchcraft because the crops failed and someone's cow gave sour milk. You're witnessing the early stages of what will become centuries of witch-hunting madness. The obsession with finding and punishing witches explodes after the plague, fueled by desperation, superstition, and the general human need to point fingers when things go sideways. The line between folk healer and spellcasting demon consort is razor thin. If you're a woman who talks back, lives alone, knows too much about plants, or owns a cat, well, congratulations. You're on a list now. Alba's trial is about as fair as a rigged dice game. The local priest, who last week failed to cure the mayor's gout, leads the charge. Witnesses testify that Alba once picked mushrooms while the wind blew west and that her bread always rises weird. She's forced to recite prayers backward and undergo the infamous water test. They tie her up, throw her in a pond and decide that if she floats, she's guilty. If she sinks, she's innocent but dead. It's hard to argue with logic that flawless. This paranoia doesn't come out of nowhere. After the plague, order crumbles, institutions wobble, old certainties crack. People want answers, but the church has none. And science, well, science is still in its 4 humours and leeches era. So fear fills the gap. Omens are everywhere. A comet streaks across the sky, definitely a sign of divine wrath. A sheep is born with 2 heads. Someone's consorting with the devil. Your dream had frogs in it? You probably have 6 weeks to live. And here's your quirky fact of the day. People believe that weather could be bewitched. That's right. Drought. Witches. Sudden hailstorm. Witches. Slightly more humid than usual. Witches. Definitely witches. In some towns, if you got caught doing laundry and the wind picked up, you might want to start packing for an extended stay in a dungeon. But it's not just witches who get the torch treatment. Heretics, anyone who questions the church's official line, are now a hot topic, and not in the fun way. You wander into a town square where a man named Thomas is giving a sermon about how maybe God doesn't actually want people burned alive for eating meat on Fridays. Big mistake. He's dragged away mid-sentence by men in black robes who work for the Inquisition, a church-run tribunal tasked with rooting out heresy like it's a hobby. The Inquisition is not a single monolithic event. There are many of them, popping up at different times in different regions. The medieval Inquisition gets rolling around the 12th century and gains steam with the Cathars, a group in southern France who believe that the material world is evil and that priests probably shouldn't own 3 houses and a vineyard. The church disagrees, violently. The Albigensian crusade that follows is less dialogue and more systematic massacre. You talk to a friar who insists the Inquisition is about saving souls, but you've seen what that looks like. Forced confessions, torture chambers, and people so broken by questioning that they forget what they were even accused of. One poor soul swears he's guilty of thinking weirdly, and begs forgiveness. They still tie him to a stake. And here's the scholarly debate still hanging in the air like smoke from a burned sermon. Was the medieval obsession with heresy and witchcraft a product of religious fervour, or was it about controlling power and social norms? Some argue the church genuinely feared spiritual corruption. Others say it was a convenient excuse to tighten its grip on an increasingly chaotic society. You suspect it was both. Faith and fear make a potent cocktail. But here's where things get complicated. Not everyone is on board. In the towns and villages you pass through, you start to hear other voices. Quiet ones. Cautious. People who grumble about the church's taxes, about priests who live better than lords, about the difference between Christ's teachings and what actually happens in a bishop's wine cellar. Dissent is growing, and it's not all being choked off by the inquisitors. In a smoky tavern, you meet a woman named Isabel who brews ale, curses creatively, and knows more about theology than half the monks you've met. She tells you about a man in England, John Wycliffe, who's translating the Bible into English and questioning church authority. He says we should all be able to read God's word, not just priests, she says. Can you imagine? You can, and the idea burns brighter than any torch carried by a mob. That's the strange paradox of this era. As control tightens, resistance grows sharper. The more people are told what to think, the more they start thinking harder. The more they're told they're damned, the more they wonder if maybe the damnation is coming from somewhere a little closer to home. Like, say, a bishop's purse. You leave the village with Albagon, Thomas vanished, and Isabel offering you a bottle of ale that could probably strip paint. As you walk down the muddy road, your head is full of sermons, screams, and a nagging question. How does anyone know what's true anymore? Tomorrow you'll head to where truth wears a robe and holds a lecture scroll because you're going to university. You arrive in the university town of Bologna just as a shouting match breaks out in the central square. At first, you think it's another witch trial, trauma flashbacks from yesterday. But no, this is something entirely different. Two men in long black robes, arms flapping like irritated ravens, are screaming Latin insults at each other over the finer points of Aristotle's metaphysics. One accuses the other of misunderstanding the nature of the soul. The other replies with what might be the medieval equivalent of, "Your mum's a Platonist." A crowd forms, cheers, and someone actually throws a cabbage. Welcome to the university. It's the 13th century, and you've landed right in the middle of the intellectual nerve centre of Europe. Universities are springing up across the continent: Paris, Oxford, Salamanca. But Bologna is special. It's the Harvard of canon law and Roman legal theory, which in practical terms means everyone here is either debating church rules or arguing about contracts no one actually understands. The city buzzes with scholars, students, and more than a few pickpockets who know exactly how distracted a man can get when discussing whether humans possess innate reason. You dodge a donkey cart and head toward the nearest academic building, which is basically a glorified barn with Latin graffiti on the walls and a suspicious smell of beer-soaked parchment. You're ushered into a lecture hall that looks like someone tried to recreate a courtroom using leftover pews and ego. The professor enters, robes swirling, beard trimmed into a point, carrying a scroll like it's a weapon. His name is Master Hugo, and he teaches philosophy, which mostly means yelling questions and demanding your soul vibrate with truth before lunch. He begins the class by reading from a text in Latin, then translating it into slightly angrier Latin. Every now and then he pauses to insult anyone not paying attention. Students furiously scribble notes with quills that squeak and splatter. One is doodling what might be a cat in a bishop's hat. Another is fast asleep with his mouth open and his ink pot dangerously close to being mistaken for a cup. You're somewhere between intrigued and terrified. Here's the academic vibe: knowledge matters, but it's also a performance. Professors argue like they're fencing, each thrust of logic followed by a parry of contradiction. The entire curriculum is based on the Trivium and Quadrivium, a collection of 7 liberal arts. First, you tackle the trivium, grammar, rhetoric and logic, the verbal weapons of medieval learning. Then, if your brain hasn't exploded, you take on the quadrivium, arithmetic, geometry, music and astronomy. That's right, math, stars, and trying to explain why a harmony sounds better than a scream. You chat with a student named Pietro who's been here for 6 years and still hasn't passed his final exam. He's studying theology, which means hours of dissecting St. Augustine, wrangling the writings of Aquinas, and wondering whether God could make a rock so heavy even he couldn't lift it. You ask if he enjoys it. It's eternal truth, he says, and occasionally free wine at disputations. That brings us to a particularly quirky medieval tradition, the disputation. Think TED Talk meets rap battle meets jury trial. Professors pose a question, say, do animals have souls? Or, is the moon evil? And students have to argue both sides using logic, scripture, and whatever caffeine substitute existed in the 13th century. The crowd shouts, judges clap, and sometimes there's wine involved. You sit in on one about whether angels take up physical space. The answer apparently depends on how recently you've eaten. Universities are deeply religious institutions, but they're also rebellious. They're tied to the church. Yes, many students and faculty are clergy, but they also challenge it constantly. They import ideas from the Muslim world, especially from scholars like Averroes and Avicenna, who preserved and expanded the works of Aristotle, while Europe was still trying to remember how to read. You hear heated arguments about reason versus faith, and the tension is real. Can logic prove God? Should it even try? That's one of the great debates that still simmers today. Were medieval universities truly bastions of free thought, or just tools for reinforcing religious orthodoxy with bigger words? Some scholars say these places planted the seeds of modern science and secularism. Others argue they were just very elaborate echo chambers for people who wore robes and thought metaphysics was a personality trait. But there's no denying the energy. You feel it in the way students stay up late copying text by candlelight, muttering Latin in their sleep. In the secret back room where someone's translating a banned Greek manuscript with a lookout at the door. In the tavern where 4 future bishops are drunkenly debating predestination, while arm wrestling a guy who just dropped out of law school to become a mercenary. And then there's the matter of tuition. Yes, students have to pay, and not just in coin. You're expected to buy your own books, hand-copied manuscripts that cost more than a small house, rent space in someone's attic, and cover your food, candles, wine, and bribes to the local bathhouse. You realise quickly that most students are from the upper crust, or at least have a rich uncle who thinks education is a good investment. Poorer students, they clean, beg, or do odd jobs just to stay enrolled. Pietro, for instance, tutors a local merchant's kid in exchange for cheese and socks. Here's your quirky historical tidbit. Some universities were so rowdy that cities tried to ban them outright. Oxford, for example, once caused such chaos that it led to a literal town versus gown riot, complete with broken shop windows and torch-wielding scholars chasing butchers. The University of Paris, frequently shut down by the king or the pope. Bologna, you're told the students here once went on strike over bad housing and won. Respect. By the time the sun dips behind the spires and bells toll for vespers, your brain is fried. You've listened to lectures on theology, peeked at star charts, argued about the soul of a goat, and shared bread with a student who insists he'll one day be pope. You're not sure what you've learned, but you definitely feel smarter, or at least louder in Latin. You head to your rented room above a cobbler's shop, your head stuffed with ideas, theories, and exactly 3 hours of sleep. The university has taught you a lot today, not just about theology and logic, but about ambition, about people stretching their minds, even in a world still crawling out of the dark. Tomorrow you'll leave the books behind and meet the people who make the city run. Not with prayers or scrolls, but with calloused hands and wooden signs. You leave the university at sunrise, ears still ringing from a half-drunk argument about whether unicorns are heretical. The streets are already alive with motion, not academic, but economic. Shopkeepers lifting their shutters, apprentices hauling barrels, a woman shouting about eggs that may or may not be today's. The intellectual elite might be sipping watered wine and debating the immortality of the soul, but the real heartbeat of the medieval city is down here, in the workshops, the markets, and the guild halls. Your feet lead you to a narrow alley lined with crooked signs, each swinging lazily in the morning breeze. A boot with a missing sole, a hammer and chisel, a painted goose that might be a swan if you squint. These are the symbols of the guilds, powerful, proud, and slightly paranoid. They're more than trade unions, they're economic fiefdoms, social networks, religious clubs, and sometimes petty little mafias. You walk into this world as an outsider. You won't stay that way for long. You start your day with the Shoemakers Guild, mostly because their hall smells the least offensive. Inside, it's all wood shavings, leather scraps, and men grunting over lasts and awls like they're conducting surgery on a particularly stubborn foot. The guildmaster, a squat man with 4 fingers and a permanent frown, welcomes you with all the enthusiasm of someone receiving a surprise tax audit. "You want to learn?" he asks, raising an eyebrow. "You got 7 years? You do not." He chuckles. "Then fetch me that glue pot." In medieval Europe, becoming a craftsman is a long, brutal, prestige-filled journey. It starts with becoming an apprentice. You're not paid. In fact, your parents might pay the master to take you. You live in his house, eat his food, sleep in the loft, and do whatever he says, including a lot of sweeping. It's not glamorous. It's certainly not hygienic, but it's the only way up. After years of training, if you haven't set yourself or the workshop on fire, you become a journeyman. Now you can travel, sell your work, and start saving. Eventually, if you're skilled and connected, you'll submit a masterpiece, a flawless example of your craft judged by your elders. If they approve, you gain entry into the guild as a full master. Your own shop, your own sign, your own miserable apprentice. You tag along with the guildmaster's apprentice, a girl named Elka, who's a foot shorter than you but somehow stronger. She shows you the tricks of the trade, soaking leather until it bends like butter, stitching until your fingers bleed, and knowing just how much to lie about a shoe's durability. Most people walk crooked, she tells you. We just make the shoes match. You move from shop to shop, getting a tour of the entire guild ecosystem. The baker's guild is busy kneading dough and cursing each other over yeast theft. The tanners work at the edge of the city because the stench of boiling animal hides is enough to make God weep. The glassblowers, perched in their infernal workshop, shape molten magic into windows for the rich and saints for the cathedrals. It's dangerous, hot, and oddly beautiful. Guilds don't just train workers, they control the market. Prices, wages, quality standards, they decide it all. You want to open a shop? Not without permission. Sell outside your district? That's cute. They fine you. Hard. Guilds keep the economy stable, yes, but also exclusionary. Innovation is often frowned upon. Outsiders are rarely welcomed. It's a delicate balance between pride in craft and protectionism, wrapped in candle wax and bureaucracy. Here's your quirky fact of the day. Some guilds had rituals so elaborate they make modern job orientation look like a coffee break. One included blindfolding the new member, making him recite prayers in Latin, swear allegiance to St. Crispin, and kiss a goose. Why? No one knows. Probably tradition. Probably hazing. Possibly wine. There's also a social side to guild life. They throw feasts. They sponsor church altars. They hold processions where everyone wears matching robes and sings slightly off-key. If one of their own falls sick or dies, the guild steps in. Food, funeral, even housing for the widow. It's more than a job. It's family, religion, identity. You don't just say, "I make shoes." You say, "I am a shoemaker." It's who you are, body and soul. Yet not all workers get this support. Beneath the guilds are the day labourers, the unskilled, the women, the migrants who never had a shot at apprenticeship. They clean, cook, carry, sew, stitch. Often for pennies, and never for prestige. You meet a seamstress named Mara who makes belts for half the town but can't even walk through the guild hall doors. "I don't need their feast," she says, adjusting her shawl. "I just want to eat." You begin to see cracks in the shiny paint. Guilds are political players too. They influence city councils, fund candidates, even start fights, sometimes literal ones, over trade routes or import taxes. In cities like Florence or Ghent, guilds run the show. And if you think a shoe guild won't burn your bakery down over price disputes, think again. Which brings us to the great historical debate. Were guilds good or bad for progress? Some historians argue they preserved craftsmanship, protected workers, and laid the groundwork for capitalism. Others claim they stifled innovation, locked out outsiders, and reinforced inequality. The truth, as usual, walks with a limp in a well-made boot. Night falls, and you sit in the square watching the guild members pack up. Elka gives you a crooked smile and hands you a half-finished shoe. "Keep practicing," she says. You admire the stitching, the curve of the sole. It's not just a shoe, it's hours of sweat, generations of knowledge, and the soft hum of pride. Tomorrow you'll explore a different kind of expression, not in leather or bread or steel, but in song, poetry, and the aching awkwardness of courtly love. You leave behind the clatter of hammers and smell of tanneries and wander toward the part of town where things are a little softer, a little more delicate, and also a little more absurd. A place where love is an art form, where words are weapons, and where reality is gently smothered under velvet and rhyme. You're entering the world of courtly love, troubadours, and romantic expectations so high they'd give modern dating apps a panic attack. Your first encounter is with a poet named Benoit who, for reasons unknown, is reclining dramatically under a pear tree and sighing loudly. He wears a tunic embroidered with lilies and carries a lute he only sort of knows how to play. He informs you, after quoting himself, that he's composing a ballad for Lady Iseldrine, who is, he whispers, married, oblivious, and tragically uninterested. You ask why he doesn't simply talk to her. He gasps. That's not how love works. This is courtly love, and it doesn't care about practicality. Born in the courts of southern France in the 12th century, shaped by bored nobles and lyrical overachievers, it redefines love as longing, suffering, and poetic agony. Ideally, it's directed at someone you absolutely cannot have, preferably a noblewoman married to someone with a large sword. You're meant to worship her from afar, write elaborate metaphors comparing her to falcons or lilies or celestial bodies, and pine forever without ever doing anything remotely useful. You attend a poetry recital that evening in the great hall of a minor noble's manor. It's dimly lit, filled with tapestries of sad unicorns and solemn saints, and the crowd is a mix of bored ladies, smug knights, and one man asleep on a platter of pears. The troubadours perform in Occitan, a language that sounds like French with a hangover, and sing about unrequited love, lost gloves, and hearts set aflame. There's weeping. There's clapping. There's a duet about eye contact that ends in someone falling off a stool. Courtly love poems are obsessed with rules. You must be chaste. You must be loyal. You must compare your beloved to natural phenomena and avoid rhyming love with dove, unless you're very good at it. Above all, the beloved must remain unattainable. If she actually reciprocates, that's basically cheating. The point is to suffer beautifully, like a nobleman with gout writing haikus in a tower. Here's your quirky fact of the day. Some manuals on courtly behaviour offered specific advice, like how to walk past your beloved without staring too obviously, or how many times a day one should sigh to remain credible. The answer apparently is 12. But not all love is poetry and restraint. You wander through the streets and see another version. Bawdy songs, flirty glances, and marriages arranged more for land than lust. In the tavern, two women are arm wrestling over a bearded carpenter. A drunk monk is singing a ballad about St. Margaret and her goat, which you're fairly certain is not sanctioned doctrine. Because love in the Middle Ages is fractured, split between idealised longing and messy human reality. Marriage is often a contract between families, alliances sealed with dowries and grudging handshakes. Love is something that happens afterward, if at all, or during, or never. You meet a merchant's daughter named Brigitte, who was married at 14 to a man twice her age, and now spends her evenings betting on chicken races and reciting rude versions of courtly ballads. Love is fine, she shrugs, but so is not being poor. Meanwhile, the troubadours keep singing. They're travelling poets, often minor nobles or professional musicians, moving from court to court, spreading stories and scandal. They're Europe's Spotify playlist, newsfeed, and fan fiction authors rolled into one. Their songs aren't just about love, they're also political, satirical, and occasionally straight-up weird. You hear one today that compares the king to a garden rake and implies his daughter is dating Satan. The room laughs. You're pretty sure someone's going to be excommunicated. The church, predictably, has mixed feelings about all this. On one hand, they support modesty, chastity, and the idea of raising love to something spiritual. On the other, they're not thrilled about songs encouraging married women to exchange veiled glances with lute players. Preachers occasionally storm into recitals and call the performers servants of lust and lies. Then they sit in the back and stay for the second verse. You visit a scriptorium where monks are copying love poems onto vellum, shaking their heads the whole time. Sensual nonsense, one mutters, while carefully illuminating the margins with tiny blushing cherubs. Scholars today still argue, was courtly love a genuine emotional movement, or just a game of nobles trying to feel important? Some see it as the beginning of modern romance, personal, emotional, not just transactional. Others call it emotional theatre, staged for power and ego. You get your own taste of the madness when a local noblewoman named Isabeau, sharp-tongued, terrifying, and clearly bored, takes an interest in you. She sends you a token, a single glove scented with rose oil and folded into a heart. You have no idea what it means, neither does anyone else. Benoit insists you must now compose a tenso, a poetic back-and-forth exchange in verse. Elka from the Shoemakers Guild suggests you just return the glove and ask what she wants. You consider both options and decide to quietly mail it back with a note that says, "Thank you." I have small hands. Night falls over the city, and you sit in a courtyard strumming a borrowed lute, plucking out a few notes you don't understand. The stars overhead are as bright as the metaphors in every poem you've heard today. Around you, people are laughing, flirting, sighing, fighting, and pretending they're part of a love story more dramatic than it probably is. And yet, something about it is moving. Beneath all the ceremony and performative swooning, there's a desire that feels familiar. To be seen, to be known, to be wanted. Maybe that's what courtly love really was. A way to say, I matter, in a world where so much of your life is arranged for you. Tomorrow you'll leave the verses behind and head east, to a city where love is calculated, politics are complex, and empires collide in golden mosaics. Because next you're going to Constantinople. You sail east across a sea that gleams like hammered metal, watching the sky change colours faster than a stained glass window on fire. The air gets warmer, saltier, and it smells like spice, sweat, and something old, older than any town you've been to so far. When the ship finally crests a gentle wave and the skyline rises into view, you stop breathing for a moment. Because there it is, Constantinople, a city so large, so glittering, and so ancient that it doesn't feel real. This is not the muddy chaos of a European trade town. This is Rome, reloaded, the second Rome, the city of emperors, saints, and more domes than a helmet shop. The walls, triple-layered and terrifying, stretch across the land like the spine of a sleeping giant. Inside those walls, a city that's been standing since the 4th century and has survived nearly everything Europe's thrown at it. You enter through the Golden Gate, beneath marble arches and mosaics that shimmer like sunlight trapped in stone. Merchants jostle beside diplomats, monks and soldiers in uniforms more polished than some castles you've seen. The streets are paved, actually paved, and lined with cypress trees and columns looted from every corner of the ancient world. Latin signs sit next to Greek graffiti, and everyone seems to be arguing about something in at least 3 languages. This is the capital of the Byzantine Empire, or as the locals call it, the Roman Empire, thank you very much. They don't care what Western Europe thinks. They've got bureaucrats, battle plans, and 400 years of smugness that comes from being the last one still standing. You're greeted by a court functionary named Michael, who wears robes so intricate you could get lost in the embroidery. He smells like myrrh and ambition. "Welcome to the Queen of Cities," he says, gesturing with a hand that definitely doesn't do manual labour. "Try not to offend anyone. We remember everything. Your first stop is the Hagia Sophia, and it's like stepping into a dream. The domes soar impossibly high, held aloft by pillars that feel too slender for the job. Light pours through windows set in golden arches, glinting off mosaics that depict Christ, the Virgin Mary, and emperors with halos only slightly smaller than their egos. You stand still, staring upward until your neck hurts, and you forget what language you're supposed to be thinking in. And here's your quirky fact of the day. The Hagia Sophia's dome was so revolutionary when it was built in the 6th century that engineers had to invent new math to make it work. It collapsed a couple times, minor detail, but when it held, it became the architectural equivalent of "don't even try to outdo us." You wander the Great Palace complex, a sprawling network of courtyards, offices and corridors filled with frescoes, guards, and the faint sound of scheming. The Emperor doesn't receive visitors today, but you hear whispers. His name is Alexios, or maybe Isaac, or possibly John. It depends on the decade. The throne room is guarded by ceremonial eunuchs in silk who glance at you like you're something they need to clean off their shoes. Byzantine politics make your head spin. This is a world of plots, poisonings, and paperwork. The emperor rules by divine right, but also needs to watch his back constantly. Everyone is educated, fluent in theology, and deadly. You meet a scholar who can quote Aristotle, debate Christ's nature in 2 languages, and then casually mention his cousin was blinded for backing the wrong patriarch. Which brings us to the icon debate. Icons, holy images of saints and Christ, are everywhere in the city. But not too long ago, people were smashing them with hammers during the iconoclast controversy, a massive theological war over whether sacred art was idolatry. One side said, These images are essential for devotion. The other said, "This is idolatry dressed in gold leaf." It got so heated that emperors were deposed, monks were tortured, and theology professors probably had the time of their lives. This wasn't just about religion, it was about power. Who decides what's holy? The emperor or the church? The East or the West? And speaking of the West, let's talk about that tension. Byzantines don't think much of Western Europe. To them, those Latin speakers across the Adriatic are crude, unwashed, and overly fond of stabbing things. But the West isn't exactly sending fruit baskets either. You've already seen the Pope crown Charlemagne as Roman Emperor a couple centuries back, a move that Byzantines consider a cosmic insult. You can't just invent emperors, Michael sniffs. We have rules. The divide is more than pride. It's cultural, religious, and growing. The Byzantines speak Greek, not Latin. Their priests marry. Their theology leans mystical while the West obsesses over scholastic logic. And though both sides call themselves Christian, they increasingly see each other as dangerously wrong. By now, the Great Schism of 1054 has split the churches officially, each side excommunicating the other in a theological food fight that's still echoing. But despite all this division, Constantinople remains a crossroads. You see Armenians, Persians, Jews, Slavs, Vikings, yes, Vikings, serving as elite palace guards. The Varangian Guard, tall, terrifying, and paid in gold. Trade goods from China, India, and Africa crowd the markets. Silks, spices, perfumes, manuscripts, and absolutely terrifying dolls. It's cosmopolitan in a way no other city in Europe is, and here's the scholarly debate still lighting up academic conferences. Was Byzantium a continuation of Rome or something else entirely? Some argue it's the same empire, adapted and evolved. Others claim it became its own creature, more Greek than Roman, more Christian than imperial. Either way, it outlasts the Western Roman Empire by nearly 1,000 years, which is an achievement no matter what you call it. At night, you walk the sea walls and look out over the Bosporus, where Europe blurs into Asia. Ships float like ghosts under a crescent moon, and the wind smells like saffron and salt. Behind you, the city glows in candlelight and flickering lanterns, golden domes catching the last of the day. It feels eternal, untouchable. But you know better. History doesn't care about walls or mosaics. The future is already circling like a vulture. Tomorrow you'll sail back west, where a different tide is rising, because next you meet traders, travellers, and one Venetian who swears he's seen China. You leave Constantinople just before dawn, standing at the prow of a merchant ship stacked with bolts of silk, bundles of cinnamon, and one very irate goose. The Bosporus glitters beneath you, the great city shrinking behind like a memory already fading into the morning mist. Ahead lies the open sea, but more importantly the open road, the endless web of trade routes connecting not just cities but entire civilizations. You're about to see how the world moves, not through kings or armies, but through merchants, travellers, maps, and lies told very convincingly at dinner tables. The ship smells like salt, tar, and ambition. Your fellow passengers are a mixed lot. A French spice buyer who speaks 5 languages badly, an Armenian mapmaker who keeps correcting the crew's course, and a Venetian in a feathered cap who won't shut up about his cousin, who went to Asia and came back with stories so wild they might just be true. His name is Antonio, and he introduces himself by bowing slightly and saying, "I can get you nutmeg that'll make your priest weep." As the ship cuts across the Aegean, you learn that Venice, that slippery little lagoon city-state, has somehow managed to claw its way into the heart of the medieval trade machine. Forget kings and knights. Merchant republics like Venice, Genoa, and Pisa are the ones getting rich. They control ports, dominate sea routes, and play rival empires against each other with a smirk and a strong fleet. You dock in Venice days later, and it's like stepping into a marketplace had a baby with a cathedral. Everything here is for sale. Spices from India, glass from Murano, wool from England, sugar from Cyprus, and religious relics that definitely look suspiciously well preserved. The streets are narrow, packed, and lined with water instead of sidewalks. Gondolas drift like lazy sharks while the upper class glides through the plazas in robes so embroidered they could be read like scrolls. Money moves through this city like blood, constant, fast, and with just a hint of violence. And here's your quirky fact of the day. Venetian merchants were so good at branding that they once sold dried rhubarb as a miracle cure from the East, convincing people it could treat everything from indigestion to spiritual melancholy. You try some, it's terrible, you feel no holier. At a tavern near the Grand Canal, Antonio invites you to meet some of his trade partners, men who've travelled the Silk Road, or at least claim they have. One of them pulls out a scrap of embroidered silk and tells a story about a city where birds drop gold into bowls, and everyone wears robes made from dragon scales. Another insists he met a man in Persia who'd seen a mountain that sang. The stories get more extravagant with each cup of wine. Then someone mentions a name that hushes the room, Marco Polo. To modern ears the name sounds like a pool game, but here it's the stuff of legend. Marco Polo, Venetian merchant turned explorer, turned courtier to the great Khan of the Mongol Empire. He travelled further than anyone from this side of Europe ever had, to China and back, supposedly spending years in the service of Kublai Khan himself. You ask if the stories are true. Antonio shrugs. Some of them. But he came back rich, didn't he? You later track down a copy of Polo's account, dictated while he was imprisoned during a war between Venice and Genoa. The book is a whirlwind of elephants, paper money, jewelled palaces, and postal systems so efficient they make medieval Europe look like a lost sock drawer. Some people treat the text as gospel, others call it fiction, exaggeration, or straight-up marketing. The truth? Probably a bit of everything. But what matters more is that it opened the medieval imagination. You realise something important. Even before the printing press, information travelled, riding the backs of traders, monks, envoys, and the occasional well-funded liar. Ideas filtered in from China, India, and the Islamic world, carried by spice caravans and curious scholars. Europeans were learning how to make better maps, navigate with astrolabes, and experiment with new crops and technologies. You hear about gunpowder, a curious invention from China already creeping into European warfare. And here's the fascinating scholarly debate. Did medieval Europe really rediscover the world, or had it always been connected and just didn't notice? Some historians argue that medieval Europeans lived in isolation, blind to the broader world. Others say trade routes, though slow, kept the world subtly intertwined, with Europe always on the receiving end of ancient, sprawling networks. You're inclined to believe the second. After all, you just drank tea from India while sitting next to a German goldsmith and a North African interpreter. Isolation seems unlikely. You join a caravan leaving Venice. No, not on camelback, but heading north by land, following the old Roman road still barely holding together. You pass through towns that feel richer than before. Fairs pop up along the route, massive markets where people gather from every corner of Europe. You spot Flemish weavers, Arabic translators, Jewish spice merchants, Slavic fur traders. Languages clash, deals are made, arguments erupt over coin weight and bolt length. Trade is messy, trade is life, and with trade comes change. Towns boom, cities expand, castles are still there, but they don't dominate like before. The power dynamic shifts, money talks, so does credit. You see double-entry bookkeeping appearing in Italian merchant ledgers, revolutionary stuff if you enjoy numbers and not going bankrupt. Banks emerge, loans become standard. The old medieval economy of land and loyalty now shares space with ledgers, risk, and speculation. Later you arrive in a mountain pass where a way station keeps track of merchants heading east and west. Inside, a wall map shows the known world. It's wildly inaccurate. The oceans look like puddles, and Africa is drawn upside down, but still it's progress. A merchant points to a spot and says, "Someday we'll get there." You ask him what he's pointing at. "India," he says, "or maybe Brazil." Who knows? You spend the night under a starlit sky beside a fire surrounded by storytellers and schemers. It occurs to you that while kings build monuments to themselves and knights chase glory, it's the merchants and travellers who quietly redraw the world. Tomorrow that world gets loud again, because next you're heading into the longest, pettiest and most drawn-out conflict of the medieval era. It's time for the 100 Years' War. You wake to the sound of boots stomping through mud, swords clanging against armour, and a guy yelling in French about someone stealing his horse. Congratulations, you've arrived smack in the middle of the 100 Years' War, a conflict so absurdly long, confusing and on-again, off-again, that no one alive at the time actually called it that. To them, it was just life. To you, It's 116 years of drama, bloodshed and paperwork disguised as warfare. The year is 1337. England and France are getting ready to throw hands, or rather swords, over who gets to wear a very shiny crown. You might think, surely this is about land honour sovereignty. Nope. It starts with a family feud so tangled it makes your average soap opera look like a kindergarten disagreement over crayons. See, the English kings had long held land in France. Big, valuable chunks, thanks to that whole Norman conquest situation back in 1066, when William the Conqueror took over England and didn't bother renouncing his holdings in France. Fast forward a few generations and the French king dies without a clear male heir. The English king, Edward III, is like, hey, I'm the grandson of a French king through my mum, so technically that crown's mine. The French nobles respond with a collective eye roll and install Philip VI, a cousin, on the throne. Edward says, cool, 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 and then starts a war that will outlive everyone involved. You ride with the English army as they march into France, the air thick with the smell of sweat, wet leather, and unreasonable confidence. They're outnumbered, underfed, and somehow still convinced they're going to win. Turns out, they're not entirely wrong. The Battle of Crécy in 1346 is your first taste of just how weird this war is going to get. The French cavalry charges in waves, flashy, arrogant, and devastatingly vulnerable to English longbows. Picture thousands of armoured knights charging headlong into a storm of arrows, flying at 200 miles per hour. Horses scream, men fall, chaos reigns. The longbow changes everything. It's cheap, deadly, and makes years of chivalric training irrelevant in about 6 seconds. And here's your quirky fact of the day. Many longbowmen chewed on garlic or wine-soaked cloth to keep their teeth from rotting during long campaigns. It didn't work, but they smelled absolutely unforgettable. The war drags on, and on, and on. There are truces, treaties, betrayals, and reboots. At one point, both countries agree to stop fighting, only for mercenaries to form rogue armies and continue pillaging the countryside for fun and profit. Then hostilities resume because someone blinked the wrong way during a royal banquet. You begin to notice that the civilians always lose. Peasants flee burning villages, crops rot in the fields, and entire regions turn into economic black holes. In France, the countryside is a patchwork of ruin. In England, taxes rise, resentment grows, and Parliament starts flexing muscles it wasn't supposed to have. War makes everyone nervous and dangerous. In 1356, you witness the Battle of Poitiers, where the Black Prince, Edward's son, known more for his fashion sense and hair than diplomacy, captures the French king, John II. That's right. He captures the actual king in battle and hauls him off to England like a very fancy hostage. France panics, England celebrates, and nothing is actually resolved. You attend a victory feast where someone tries to roast a peacock in gold leaf. It's disgusting and somehow still undercooked. Eventually, you visit the English court during one of the war's quieter years. Everyone's exhausted. Parliament is arguing over how much to spend on shipping troops across the Channel. You meet a soldier-turned-bard who tells you, "We've been fighting the French since my grandfather's day. My son will probably do the same. His son is 5 and already owns a toy sword." Then, just as the French begin to push back and regain ground, you arrive in the year 1415. Cue drumroll, cue dramatic fog, cue the Battle of Agincourt. This one's legend. The English, led by the young and somewhat terrifying Henry V, are starving, sick, and heavily outnumbered. The French outclass them in cavalry, numbers, and moustaches. But the battlefield is muddy, narrow, and perfectly terrible for horses. Once again, the longbow does the work. French nobles charge and get stuck in the muck. English arrows rain down. It's like Crécy all over again, but messier. By the end, the French are decimated, and Henry is hailed as a war god. You hear someone shout, "Once more unto the breach," and then promptly fall face first into a puddle. Back in Paris, morale plummets. The French royal family is fractured. The king, Charles VI, believes he's made of glass and refuses to be touched. The nobles are plotting. The peasants are rioting. Enter a new player, Joan of Arc, but you'll meet her tomorrow. For now, let's talk about the big picture. The 100 Years' War isn't one war. It's a series of conflicts, interspersed with shaky truces, assassinations, dynastic marriages, and enough shifting alliances to make your head spin. The war changes not just who wears what crown, but how Europe understands national identity, warfare, and sovereignty. And here's the scholarly debate. Did the war actually help create modern nations? Some argue it cemented English and French nationalism. We're not just people who happen to live in the same region, we are a people. Others claim the war's real legacy is chaos, centralisation of royal power, and the collapse of feudalism, as kings learned to raise standing armies and tax their people directly. Either way, the world that comes out of this mess doesn't look much like the one that entered it. You spend the night in a French village recently reclaimed from English control. It's quiet now, just the creak of wind in the thatch and the distant croak of frogs. But the scars are everywhere. Burned houses, empty farms, graves without names. A young boy hands you a broken sword he found in a field. He asks if the war is over. You don't know how to answer. Tomorrow, you'll meet the girl who dares to say yes. Because Joan of Arc is about to walk into history, barefoot, bold, and burning with something no one can quite name. You first hear her name whispered around a smoky inn fire, between sips of thin wine and muttered prayers for peace. Jean, someone says, the maid from Domremy. You assume it's gossip, a tale spun to pass the time in a war where hope has been increasingly hard to come by. But the story spreads like a spark in a dry field. The French have a new leader, they say. Not a general, not a prince. A teenage girl who hears voices from heaven and says she's been sent by God to save France. Naturally, you assume everyone's gone mad. Then you see her. She's not what you expect. No gold halo, no glowing aura. Just a slight girl, maybe 17, with cropped black hair, a suit of plain armour, and a presence that makes people fall silent. Her name is Jeanne d'Arc, and when she speaks, even knights listen. There's nothing soft in her voice, no hesitation, no theatrics, just clarity, conviction. She tells the Dauphin she'll see him crowned king. She tells the soldiers they will win, and somehow they believe her. You follow her to Orléans, a city under siege by the English. The air is thick with smoke and despair. Supplies are low, morale lower. For months the French have failed to break the siege, but Joan, yes, you're calling her Joan now, arrives like a storm. She rides out in gleaming armour under a banner depicting Christ and angels, shouting commands with the authority of someone who hasn't been told yet that this is impossible. Because no one's told her she can't win, or if they have, she ignored them. And here's your quirky fact of the day. Joan never actually wielded a sword in battle. Not like the knights. She carried a banner, not a blade. But that banner, white and gold, fluttering above the fray, became something greater than steel. Soldiers claimed it turned arrows, that it rallied the frightened, that it was proof God hadn't entirely abandoned them. The siege of Orléans breaks in just 9 days. 9. That's not just a military victory, it's a miracle. News spreads like wildfire. Joan becomes a symbol, a saint in training, a walking contradiction. A teenage girl in an age of grizzled commanders, a peasant among nobles, a prophet in a war that forgot what it was fighting for. You march with her through towns that had given up. People cry when they see her. Old women kiss the hem of her robe, children run behind her horse. One soldier carves a small wooden statue of her and sleeps with it under his cloak like a charm. But the church doesn't know what to do with her. The clergy argue. Is she divinely inspired or dangerously presumptuous? Visions aren't exactly rare in medieval Europe, especially among poor, deeply religious villagers, but few visionaries end up commanding armies and whispering into the ears of kings. Speaking of kings, Joan marches with the Dauphin to Reims, where she insists on his coronation. Against every prediction, they succeed. The boy she calls Gentle Dauphin becomes Charles VII, crowned in a grand cathedral while Joan stands beside him, eyes unblinking. Her mission, she says, is fulfilled. But history isn't a fairy tale, and you start to feel the weight of that realization as Joan lingers too long in the halls of power. The new king grows cold, the courtiers grow cautious. Joan wants to press the advantage, take Paris, finish the job. But Charles hesitates. Politics creep back in. Battles are lost. Support wanes. You sense the shift. The uncomfortable silence when her name is mentioned. The priests who stop calling her a gift from God and start mumbling about pride. Then, the worst happens. Joan is captured by the Burgundians, French allies of the English. She's handed over to the English for a hefty ransom. You watch, helpless, as the girl who turned the tide of war is abandoned by the very king she crowned. You ask someone in court if there will be a rescue attempt. He just shrugs. She's imprisoned in Rouen, placed in chains, and subjected to a trial so grotesquely rigged it makes your skin crawl. The church, or at least the parts of it that answer to English interests, decides that Joan is to be tried for heresy and witchcraft. Her crime, claiming divine guidance without clerical permission, dressing in men's clothing, challenging the status quo, winning. The trial transcripts survive and they're chilling. You read them decades later and still feel the chill. Joan, illiterate and exhausted, answers with grace and clarity, outmanoeuvring university-trained inquisitors. "Are you in a state of grace?" they ask. "If I am," she replies, "may God keep me there. If not, may he bring me to it." That answer alone should have ended the trial. Instead, it seals her fate. On May 30th, 1431, Joan of Arc is led to a stake in the marketplace of Rouen. She's 19. The square is packed, but silent. She asks for a cross. A sympathetic English soldier hands her one made of sticks. You watch her pray, cry out for Christ, and die in flame and smoke while the crowd watches, too stunned or too ashamed to speak. Her ashes are thrown into the Seine, as if erasing her could undo what she stood for. But history doesn't work that way. Within 25 years, Joan is posthumously retried and declared innocent. The church that burned her says, "Oops," and shrugs. By the 20th century, she is canonized as a saint. Statues go up. Churches bear her name. She becomes a symbol not just of France, but of faith, courage, resistance. The girl who was once mocked, condemned, and silenced now stands in cathedrals, sword raised in bronze and marble. And here's the scholarly debate. Was Joan a visionary, a tool of royal propaganda, or a self-taught genius? Some argue she was manipulated by the court and discarded when her usefulness ran out. Others believe she genuinely heard voices and acted with divine guidance. A few see her as a political genius who played a role no man could have filled. The truth may never be pinned down, but her impact, unmistakable. You leave Rouen with ashes in your thoughts and a deeper understanding of the strange, sharp edges of power. Joan's story isn't just about war, it's about belief, about the terrifying cost of speaking with certainty in a world ruled by doubt, about the cracks in every empire where something sacred still dares to grow. Tomorrow, you'll return to the politics of popes and kings, because while France wrestled with destiny, the church fractured from within. And now, there are 2 popes. You leave the ashes of Rouen behind and journey south, following a trail that doesn't smell like smoke and blood, but incense and parchment. The war may be roaring across kingdoms, but deep within the sanctified halls of the church, a different kind of battle is brewing, one without arrows but no less venomous. And it begins, of all places, not in Rome, but in a quiet little town in the south of France called Avignon. You arrive to find something off. The buildings are grand, yes, palaces built with limestone and ambition, but there's a strange emptiness in the air, like someone moved all the holiness into storage. That's because the Pope lives here now, not in the Vatican. Welcome to the Avignon papacy, a 70-year stretch of papal relocation that has theologians clutching their rosaries and Italians muttering darkly into their wine. The year is 1309, and the Pope, Clement V, a Frenchman, has decided that Rome is too unstable, too dangerous, and frankly, too smelly. So he moves the papal court to Avignon, smack in the middle of territory controlled by the French crown. Temporary, he says, for safety, he insists. But temporary turns into 7 popes, all French, all cosy with the French monarchy, and all slowly transforming the papacy into something that looks a lot like a luxury resort for bishops. You're escorted through the Palace of the Popes, a massive fortress-like complex that screams holy real estate investment. The halls are lined with frescoes, the wine cellars are disturbingly large, and the cardinals float through the corridors like ducks in velvet. The opulence is overwhelming. This isn't the church of Peter and fishermen, this is the church of accountants and chefs. One pope reportedly maintained a pet lion and ordered 5-course feasts while Europe reeled from plague and famine. And here's your quirky fact of the day. During the Avignon years, the church developed a habit of selling indulgences, payments in exchange for time off purgatory. Theologically controversial, economically brilliant. You can feel the gears of corruption grinding into place, but not everyone's impressed. In Rome, chaos reigns. Locals scream for the Pope's return. Pilgrims arrive to find basilicas crumbling and no pontiff in sight. A woman named Catherine of Siena, young, intense, and terrifyingly devout, writes scorching letters to the Pope, calling him out for cowardice and spiritual negligence. "Get back to Rome," she says, "or may your tongue rot out." Okay, that's paraphrased, but you get the tone. Eventually guilt, or politics, wins. In 1377, Pope Gregory XI moves the papacy back to Rome. The crowds cheer, the bells ring, and everyone breathes a sigh of relief. For a minute. Then Gregory dies, and the real mess begins. It's 1378, and the cardinals gather in Rome to elect a new pope. The Roman mob surrounds the building chanting, "A Roman pope, or your heads." The cardinals, sweating through their robes, elect Urban VI, an Italian. Crisis averted, right? Not even close. Urban turns out to be aggressive, reform-minded, and incredibly unpopular with the French faction. Within months, many cardinals flee and declare that the election was made under duress invalid. They elect a second pope, Clement VII, who sets up shop, wait for it, back in Avignon. That's right. Now there are two popes, each claiming to be the true successor of St. Peter, each excommunicating the other, each backed by rival kingdoms. Europe divides like a giant ecclesiastical divorce. France, Scotland and Aragon back Avignon. England, the Holy Roman Empire and Scandinavia side with Rome. The Church, meant to be the unifying spiritual force of Christendom, now has two heads shouting across the Alps. You walk through a town in Flanders where people can't agree which pope to pray for. One priest flips a coin before Mass, another simply prays for the pope who's right, whichever that may be. Confusion reigns, and beneath that confusion, doubt. If the Church can't even pick a single leader, what does that mean for the souls it's supposed to shepherd? Theologians and scholars scramble to make sense of it. Some push for a council to resolve the issue, others just double down and hope their pope outlasts the other, but the damage is done. The Great Schism, as it comes to be known, stretches for decades, nearly 40 years of divided authority, political brawling, and spiritual whiplash. And here's the scholarly debate. Was this the beginning of the end for the unified medieval church? Some historians argue that the Avignon papacy and schism shattered the illusion of papal infallibility, sowing the seeds for the Reformation to come. Others claim the church bounces back just fine, eventually, even if it takes a couple of councils, some new doctrines, and a fair bit of damage control. In the meantime, you attend a council in Pisa, where a group of exasperated clerics tries to solve the problem by deposing both popes and electing a third, Alexander V. This goes about as well as you'd expect. Now there are 3 popes, and Europe collectively facepalms. It isn't until the Council of Constance in 1417 that the crisis finally ends. All 3 papal claimants are pressured, bribed, or quietly nudged into stepping down or dying, and a new pope, Martin V, is elected. Unity is restored. Kind of. The people are exhausted, the church's authority is bruised, and no one really trusts the clergy the way they used to. You leave the council halls with parchment tucked under your arm, full of theological notes and half-finished insults. You pass a friar on the road who mutters, "Maybe we need less gold and more gospel," and you wonder just how deep this fracture goes. Tomorrow you'll find out what happens when the peasants stop kneeling and start standing up, because this time they've had enough. You wake to shouting, angry, rhythmic, full of smoke and boots and the unmistakable sound of 1,000 people, realizing they have nothing to lose. You throw open the shutters of your rented room and see them. Peasants. Not just 1 or 2, but a crowd swelling down the muddy lane, wielding pitchforks, rakes, sticks, and in one case, a saucepan. They're chanting something about bread, justice, and hanging the reeve. This is not a festival. This is a rebellion. You scramble into your boots and follow them into the streets. Smoke curls in the distance from what used to be the manor house. Someone is painting crude slogans on the church wall in pig's blood. A boy runs past you barefoot, swinging a stick and grinning like it's a feast day. A woman in a tattered cloak carries a sign made from an old washing paddle. No more lords. You've stumbled into the peasants' revolt. The year is 1381, and England is cracking. The Black Death wiped out half the workforce a generation ago, and yet, somehow, the lords still want their dues. Wages are frozen by law. Taxes are higher than ever, and a new poll tax demanding payment from every adult regardless of income is the final insult. You join a crowd outside a tax collector's house. The door is locked, a window smashes, The collector is dragged into the square and told to pay his own poll tax with interest. You meet a man named Wat Tyler, a former soldier turned firebrand. He speaks in clear, steady tones that carry over the crowd. "We are all sons of Adam and Eve," he says, "so by what right are they called lords, and we serfs?" The people cheer like thunder. You've heard sermons in cathedrals less convincing than this. He's not just rallying peasants, he's igniting a movement. The rebels march toward London, a ragged army growing by the hour. Bakers, ploughmen, shepherds, coopers, anyone who's ever paid too much, worked too hard, and bowed too often. They move fast. You march with them, passing torched barns, hacked up manorial ledgers, and one unfortunate nobleman who now looks like a scarecrow on a stick. When they reach the city, the gates are thrown open, not in resistance, but in solidarity. Inside, the rebels storm the Tower of London, pulling out hated officials and executing them in the square. The Archbishop of Canterbury, beheaded on the spot, tax collectors, gone, royal treasuries, raided. For one dizzying moment, it feels like the world is turning upside down. The lowest of the low have kicked down the door of power, and no one seems able to stop them. But then comes the king, Richard II, a boy of just 14. He rides out to meet the rebels at Smithfield, all bright armour and borrowed dignity. Wat Tyler presents their demands: abolition of serfdom, fair rents, a general pardon, and the removal of corrupt officials. Richard nods solemnly and says, "You shall have it." For a moment the crowd roars. It feels like history might pivot. Then Wat Tyler is stabbed to death by the Lord Mayor of London. In the confusion, the king orders the rebels to disperse. He promises more talks, more pardons. The crowd hesitates, stunned, then breaks apart. Days later, the rebel leaders are hunted down, thousands are executed, the promises vanish like mist. The king rides back to Westminster and tells the nobles, "Serfs you were, and serfs you shall remain." But something has shifted. The revolt may have failed in the moment, but the idea doesn't die. Across Europe, in Flanders, Germany, France, similar uprisings flare. In each case, the same pattern: crushing taxes, shrinking freedoms, rising expectations. The lords fight back, but they also start paying more attention. New laws are drafted, labour becomes harder to control, wages inch upward. Serfdom begins to crack, not all at once, but permanently. You visit a village that had risen up and survived. The manor is abandoned. The old lord fled to the city and never returned. The people now farm communally, make their own decisions, hold village meetings. It's small, messy, imperfect, but it's a beginning. And here's your quirky fact of the day. Some rebel groups during these revolts adopted bizarre nicknames like the Poor Fellows or the Good Men, a bit of branding that made them sound more like fraternity chapters than revolutionary mobs. In one village, the local rebel leader went by Robin of the Hood. Originality was not the priority. There's a scholarly debate you overhear at a university tavern years later. A professor argues the peasants' revolt was doomed from the start. Too disorganised, too reactionary, too dependent on charismatic leaders. Another scholar fires back that it marked the beginning of a political consciousness among the lower classes. They understood, she says, slamming her tankard, that power wasn't divine, it was negotiable. You think back to the girl with the washing paddle sign, the boy swinging his stick like it mattered, Wat Tyler's steady voice. You remember the look on a tax collector's face when he realised no one was listening to him anymore? The revolts don't topple monarchies, not yet. But they teach everyone a lesson. Fear travels fast, but so does hope. You leave the village behind, passing fields where crops now grow without a landlord watching. The wind carries songs that weren't sung before, rough, hopeful, and out of tune. They're not the old chants of suffering, they're new, they're something like freedom. Tomorrow that freedom will be tested again, not from below, but from within the church itself. Because the Inquisition is waiting and it doesn't like questions. You don't walk into an Inquisition, you stumble, you're dragged. Or you wake up and find that somehow you've become the subject of one. It doesn't announce itself with fanfare. It seeps in, slowly, silently, like smoke under a door. You feel it in the sideways glances, the sudden quiet when you enter a room, the way your name starts to echo in whispers rather than greetings. You've just said the wrong thing, at the wrong time, in the wrong town. And now someone wants to know what you believe. Welcome to the Inquisition. where your thoughts are not entirely your own. You're in late 15th century Spain, and the atmosphere has the taut, dry crackle of a room waiting for a match. The monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, have just married, uniting their kingdoms and launching what they call a project of purity and unity. Sounds noble. What it actually means is consolidation of power, both political and spiritual, and that means hunting down anything that threatens the status quo. Chief among these threats, heretics. Now, heresy isn't just a wrong opinion, it's a crime against God, against the Church, and against the fragile architecture of belief that holds medieval society together. A heretic isn't someone who's simply mistaken. They're someone who knows the truth and chooses to reject it, or worse, spread something else, and that apparently includes people who read the wrong books, eat the wrong food on Fridays, or just don't blend in. You pass by a town where the entire Jewish quarter has been emptied. Not destroyed, just vacated. Quiet. Tidy. The walls still bear marks from mezuzahs now torn down. You learn that under the new laws, Jews were given a choice: convert to Christianity or leave. Some did convert, and some, the Church now suspects, didn't mean it. These conversos, they say, are pretending, secretly clinging to their old faith, lighting Sabbath candles in basements, whispering Hebrew prayers behind locked doors. That's where the Inquisition comes in. A tribunal is set up in a former monastery. You're allowed to watch the proceedings, from a safe distance. The accused is a merchant, maybe 60, dignified even in his chains. The inquisitors wear black robes. Their questions are soft, gentle even, but each one is a hook. Do you believe Christ is divine? Did you eat pork last Saturday? Can you recite the Nicene Creed? They already know the answers. The trial is more about confirmation than truth. The merchant hesitates too long on one question. That's enough. He's led away. Here's your darkly fascinating, quirky fact of the day. The Spanish Inquisition kept meticulous records. Every word, every cough, every confession, documented in cold, clean Latin. Historians today pore over these dusty ledgers, tracing the outlines of fear and paranoia with academic detachment. You've seen one of these books. It reads like a ledger of lives slowly unravelled. The punishments vary: public penance, whippings, prison, and for the worst offenders, or the ones who refuse to confess, execution, often by burning. Not by the Church directly, of course. They're very careful about that. The condemned are handed over to the secular arm, which does the dirty work. Everyone pretends it's not as cruel as it is. There's a phrase they use: relaxed to the secular arm. It sounds so polite, like they're handing someone a towel, not condemning them to flame. But it's not just Spain. The Inquisition has roots going back to the 12th century, when the Church first began formal efforts to root out heresy in places like Languedoc, where the Cathars had set up a wildly inconvenient dualist belief system. Cathars believed the material world was evil, and that the Church was corrupt, both true enough to be uncomfortable. The Church responded with Crusade and then Inquisition. By the 14th century, inquisitorial courts had become permanent fixtures in parts of France, Italy, and eventually most of Catholic Europe. You find yourself in one of these earlier tribunals, in a dusty Italian hill town. The inquisitor is an educated Dominican friar, with the posture of a man who hasn't slept in weeks. He doesn't look evil, he looks tired. He explains that his role is to save souls, through questioning, persuasion, and if necessary, pressure. He's not torturing heretics for fun, he's rescuing them from damnation. You don't say anything. You just listen to the woman screaming in the next room. The tools of torture are never officially required, but rarely avoided. The rack, the strappado, the water cure, always applied with theological justification, always prefaced with a prayer. Here's where the scholarly debate gets loud. Some argue the Inquisition was limited and restrained, particularly compared to secular justice of the time, which could execute you for stealing bread. Others claim the Inquisition's true legacy lies not in body counts, but in the psychological terror it spread, how it taught people to police their thoughts, fear their neighbours, and see questioning not as curiosity, but as sin. And not everyone caught in the net is Jewish or Cathar or obviously non-conforming. You meet a young man arrested for possessing a banned book, a girl accused of praying in a language the priest doesn't understand, a widow who simply speaks her mind too often. The line between dissent and heresy is thin, wobbly, and frequently moved without notice. Eventually you meet someone who refuses to bend. An old scholar, grey-bearded and weary-eyed, who calmly tells the Inquisitors, "I believe what I believe." He knows what's coming, but he says it anyway. You watch him walk to the stake with the dignity of a man who's outlived fear. You want to believe that matters, but then the wind changes, the fire starts, and belief doesn't stop the burning. Yet amid the darkness, something else flickers. Quiet, persistent, impossible to fully smother. Ideas, whispered in corners, passed in letters, hidden in songs. People are still reading, still asking, still wondering, even here. You leave the town by moonlight, your coat smelling faintly of incense and ash. You pass a crossroads where someone's carved into the wood of a signpost. What if they're wrong? Tomorrow you'll follow that question into a revolution of a different kind, because someone just invented a machine that can spread ideas faster than they can be burned, and it's called a printing press. You expect to smell smoke or incense when you walk into the next town, but what hits you instead is ink. Thick, sticky, metallic ink. It clings to everything. The air, the wood, the calloused fingers of the men hunched over rows of movable type. The sound in the workshop is steady. Clack, roll, press, sigh, repeat. This isn't a church or a battlefield. It's a printing press, and you're watching history quietly explode. In the corner stands the machine itself, a squat, creaking marvel of wood and metal. It looks like a wine press that got repurposed by a librarian with rage issues. Sheets of paper hang from lines like laundry. The smell of oil and lead is overwhelming, but the workers are focused, mechanical, almost reverent. They ink the type, lower the press, raise the platen, and just like that, a page is born. Words, black and bold, sharp as a sword's edge. The year is somewhere around 1455, and this device, invented or perfected by Johannes Gutenberg, is already shaking the world like a tower with termites in its foundations. You don't feel the tremors right away, but they're there. You pick up a still damp copy of the Gutenberg Bible, freshly printed in Mainz. The type is so crisp it looks hand-lettered. It isn't. That's the magic. Before this, a book took months or years to produce. Monks bent over vellum by candlelight, copying by hand, often with mistakes or spontaneous additions like doodles in the margins. Now, you can print dozens of pages a day, nearly identical, sharp, efficient, and, most importantly, cheap. You meet the press operator who explains that this is just the beginning. Already pamphlets are flying off presses, sermons, calendars, decrees. Some are religious, some political. Some are just spicy gossip about nobles behaving badly. Every town wants a press now, he says, smirking, and every bishop wants to shut one down. You quickly realise why. Words are power, and now everyone can have them. Here's your quirky fact of the day. One of the earliest bestsellers wasn't a Bible, but a book called The Ars Moriendi, The Art of Dying. A handy how-to on dying well, with dramatic woodcuts showing demons tempting you on your deathbed and angels trying to clean up the mess. Very uplifting. The press spreads like fire in dry wheat. Within decades, thousands of books flood Europe. From Italy to England, presses pop up in university towns, royal courts, and merchant cities. The number of books in Europe multiplies by the millions. Literacy begins to rise, not everywhere, not instantly, but steadily. People who never dreamed of owning a book can now afford one, or 5, or 20. You travel to a university town in Germany where students are copying theological pamphlets by hand just to keep up with demand. One professor swears that he saw 4 different versions of the same sermon circulating, each with slight changes. At this point, he mutters, I don't even know what Luther actually said. You blink. Luther? That name hasn't meant anything to you yet, but you file it away. It'll matter soon. Back in the printing shop, you watch the pressmen argue over fonts, Gothic or Roman. The debate gets heated. You learn that typography is a surprisingly passionate field. They settle on a compromise, large Gothic headers with Roman body text. Everyone sulks but agrees. It looks expensive, someone says. That's the goal. You sit down to read one of the first printed almanacs. It has weather predictions, planting charts, moon phases, and a recipe for treating gout using boiled leeks and crushed emerald. That part probably needs a little more peer review, but not everyone's thrilled about this new world of mass communication. You overhear a bishop in France railing against the spread of unregulated texts. He fears heresy, confusion, and a public too dumb to know what it's reading. The word of God, he declares, should not be cheapened by mass production. Later, you see him trying to order a printed missal. Irony is still alive and well. And here's the scholarly debate. Did the printing press cause the Reformation or just accelerate it? Some say that Martin Luther would have been just another eccentric monk without access to print. Others argue that the ideas were already brewing and the press merely sped up what was inevitable. Either way, once an idea hits the page, it moves faster than horses and deeper than sermons. And once people begin to own ideas, they're less willing to be told what to think. You stay long enough to watch a press operator crank out a satirical pamphlet mocking indulgence sellers. The woodcut shows a priest weighing souls like sausages. It's ridiculous and brilliant. You buy 3 copies, you travel next to Venice, where the printing scene is absolutely unhinged. Books pour from presses like rain. A single publisher, Aldus Manutius, is producing compact, affordable editions of the classics. Virgil, Cicero, Aristotle. Stuff only monks and nobles used to touch is now found in the pockets of bakers, barbers, and bored teenagers. And here's something you didn't expect. Women are reading too. You meet a noblewoman who quotes Seneca while sipping almond wine. A merchant's daughter reciting Dante from memory. A washerwoman with a dog-eared copy of a prayer book she can actually read herself. One press even puts out a book on how to educate daughters. Radical stuff for a world still trying to figure out if women have souls. You notice the slow shift in conversation across Europe. People argue about theology outside of churches. People quote philosophers they've never met. Commoners challenge priests. Students debate professors. Books are smuggled, banned, burned, printed again. And this is only the beginning. You stand at the edge of a marketplace as a man hands out small slips of paper. Flyers, he calls them. You read one. It's a poem about justice. Another urges a boycott of corrupt officials. Another mocks the Pope. The future is here. It's printed in black ink on cheap paper, passed from hand to hand with inky fingers and wide eyes. You look up and realise the game has changed. Authority no longer rests in the robes of a bishop or the seal of a king. It sits in letters, sentences, books. And those books are no longer trapped in monasteries. They're everywhere. Tomorrow you'll watch how fragile that old authority really is. Because an empire that has stood for 1,000 years is about to fall, and its last breath will echo from the walls of Constantinople. You hear it before you see it. A rumble in the earth. Not thunder, not drums, but the sound of something old and enormous finally coming apart. When you reach the walls of Constantinople, you think maybe you've arrived too late. The air is thick with smoke. Ash flutters down like grey snow. Cannon fire rolls through the streets like distant applause. You look up, and there, across the water, you see them. Ships. Hundreds. Flags you don't recognise. And above the chaos, the great dome of the Hagia Sophia still gleams defiantly in the sun. But you know, this is the end. It's May 1453, and the city that once stood as the final flickering flame of the Roman Empire is about to fall. Constantinople, the jewel of the East, the city of emperors, saints and scholars, has held the line for over 1,000 years. It survived sieges, fires, earthquakes, crusaders, and more backstabbing than a season of reality television. But now, facing the unstoppable rise of the Ottoman Empire, it stands alone. You join the defenders along the Theodosian walls, those legendary triple layers of stone and brick that once made the city untouchable. They stretch for miles, scarred but still standing. Men and boys, Greeks, Genoese mercenaries, even monks, man the battlements with crossbows and desperation. Supplies are low, morale is worse, but the banners are still flying. The man in charge is Constantine XI Palaiologos, the last Byzantine emperor. His armour is dull, his beard streaked with grey, but his eyes are clear. He knows the odds, he fights anyway. You hear him speak to the people on the eve of the final assault. To die for our faith and our city is the highest honour, he says. No theatrics, just a man choosing defiance over despair. And here's your quirky fact of the day. The city's defenders tried everything, even chaining the Golden Horn shut, a classic move from earlier sieges. But Sultan Mehmed II, the Ottoman ruler laying siege, had his men drag ships over land to bypass the chain. That's right, over land. Logs, grease, manpower, and impossible determination. You watch from the walls, stunned, as ships appear where ships shouldn't be. Mehmed II, just 21 years old, is no ordinary conqueror. He's educated, fluent in several languages, and obsessed with Alexander the Great. But more than that, he's determined to make history, and he knows the symbolism of this city. If Constantinople falls, it doesn't just mark the end of a city, it's the end of Rome itself. The final flicker of an empire that began with togas and legions now braces for cannon fire and chaos. Speaking of cannons, Mehmed's got one called Basilica, a behemoth cast by a Hungarian engineer named Urban. It takes 60 oxen to move and fires stone balls the size of bathtubs. Each shot shakes the earth, sends dust spiralling into the sky, and leaves craters in walls that were never meant for this kind of warfare. The siege lasts for 53 days. The nights are worse than the days. Flaming arrows, sabotage attempts, whispered prayers. Inside the city, civilians weep in the shadow of crumbling towers. Priests hold services non-stop. Merchants board up their shops and kiss their ledgers goodbye. Some nobles still cling to hope, others quietly prepare to flee. On May 28th, the final mass is held in the Hagia Sophia. Candles flicker. The air is heavy with incense and dread. For the first time in generations, Orthodox and Catholic Christians stand side by side, desperate enough to set aside centuries of division. You stand in the back, pressed between frightened faces, and realise that this building, this marvel of stone and spirit, is about to become something else entirely. At dawn on May 29th, the Ottomans attack. You're on the wall when it happens. Waves of soldiers crash against the defences. The defenders fight like demons. But the cannons have done their work. Breaches appear, arrows darken the sky. The Genoese commander Giovanni Giustiniani is wounded and carried away. That's the turning point. The defenders lose heart. The gate at Kirka Porta, either forced open or left ajar, is the crack in the dam. Ottoman forces flood in. You see Constantine XI vanish into the melee. Some say he throws off his imperial regalia and dies fighting like a common soldier. Others believe he escaped, cloaked in mystery. But the empire ends with no fanfare, no surrender, no treaty. It simply stops. The sack of the city begins. Churches are looted. Homes are ransacked. Screams echo down once noble streets. You duck into an alley, watch helplessly as the Hagia Sophia is stormed. Within hours, the building becomes a mosque. The chandeliers remain, but now they swing in a different rhythm. The murals of Christ and Mary are covered, not destroyed, preserved, hidden beneath plaster, waiting for another age. And here's the scholarly debate. Did the fall of Constantinople end the Middle Ages? Some say yes. It's the bookend to an era that began with Rome's collapse in the West. Others argue that history isn't so clean, that the Renaissance was already blooming, that new empires were already rising. But no one denies this. The world changes that day. The old Christian East is gone. The Ottomans now hold the crossroads between Europe and Asia. In the months that follow, scholars, artists and thinkers flee west, carrying manuscripts, ideas, and the Greek language with them. They pour into Italy, France and Spain, bringing with them the lost text of the ancients, sparking a flame that will feed the Renaissance. It's a strange irony. The fall of a city breathes new life into a continent. You leave Constantinople, not by ship, but quietly, on foot, through a narrow gate guarded now by men in turbans and curved swords. They let you pass with a nod. You look back once. The skyline is the same, but everything has changed. Tomorrow you'll follow those fleeing scholars into a world of art, science and human curiosity. Because something else is beginning now. A rebirth that doesn't come with swords, but with paintbrushes and notebooks. You follow the survivors west, their carts heavy with books, relics and quiet genius. The roads out of Constantinople bleed into winding Italian hills, dusted in gold and humming with possibility. You can feel the shift, subtle at first, like the scent of spring before it breaks into full bloom. The world isn't ending, it's unfolding. Because even as empires fall, something else rises in their shadow. You've arrived in the Renaissance and it doesn't so much kick down the door as whisper, "Look closer." You pass through Florence, where the very air feels expensive. Every street corner looks like a sketch waiting to happen, and everyone seems to be working on a fresco, a statue, or a philosophical treatise. This is no medieval mud town. This is a place where even the bankers debate Plato. You spend an afternoon watching two men argue about the proportions of the human foot. One is a sculptor, the other is a priest. Neither is wrong. At the heart of the city is a name spoken like a charm. Medici, bankers, patrons, puppet masters. Their coins fund paintings and palaces. Their libraries swell with texts from Greece, newly translated, newly cherished. You tour one of those libraries. It's dim, fragrant with vellum and wax, and stacked to the rafters with Homer, Euclid, Galen, and Ptolemy. Names that had once vanished into dust and now shine like new coins.
You meet a man in a small workshop covered in paper, paint, and chaos. He's sketching something that looks like a bird but with gears. "It's a flying machine," he says, not looking up. "Probably won't work." But that's not the point. His name is Leonardo da Vinci, and he's the kind of person who will start the day painting a saint, spend lunch dissecting a corpse, and finish the evening sketching siege weapons. You ask him why he does it. He shrugs. Because it's all connected. And here's your quirky fact of the day. Leonardo wrote in mirror script, backwards, possibly to keep nosy assistants from stealing his ideas, or maybe just to mess with future historians. Either way, you try it. You fail. He smirks. Across the street, a dome rises over Florence, Brunelleschi's dome. You climb it, breathless, dizzy, half convinced the stairs were designed to test your moral character. At the top, the view spills out in every direction. Terracotta rooftops, cypress trees, the soft curve of the Arno River. You realize something. This is beauty with math behind it. Geometry, proportion, harmony, art becomes science, and science becomes art. The church still looms large, but even popes are commissioning naked statues now. You visit Rome, where a young sculptor named Michelangelo is hammering away at a block of marble like it personally insulted him. The result will be David, a 17-foot-tall tribute to human willpower, complete with impossibly perfect calves. "Why so muscular?" someone asks. Michelangelo doesn't answer. He just keeps carving. And if Florence is the Renaissance's heart, Venice is its bloodstream. You float through canals lined with palazzos and presses, books everywhere, Bibles, poetry, anatomy guides. One merchant hands you a copy of The Prince by Machiavelli and whispers, "Just don't read it out loud." You do. It's spicy, cold, honest. You wonder how many rulers are underlining passages right now with shaky hands. Meanwhile, science is getting bold. You meet a Polish man named Copernicus, who quietly suggests the Earth might not be the center of the universe. You ask what gave him that idea. He points to some rough charts and says, "It just makes more sense." You nod slowly, and then look around, wondering how long it'll take for the church to notice. Spoiler, not long. And here's the scholarly debate. Was the Renaissance really a rebirth or just a fancy remix? Some say it simply polished old ideas from antiquity and slapped new paint on them. Others argue it was a genuine leap, one that re-centered the individual, elevated observation, and planted the seeds for the modern world. You ask a philosopher in Padua what he thinks. He just laughs and says, "Both," then pours more wine. You notice how the tone of life is changing. Time is measured not just in bells, but in appointments, projects, and ambition. The old rhythms of feast and famine are giving way to schedules, contracts, careers. Painters sign their work now. Writers seek fame. Inventors publish their designs. People aren't just living, they're trying to leave a mark. But not everyone is invited. Outside the salons and academies, plague still stalks. Poverty still grinds, and not everyone can afford a telescope or a fresco. A woman you meet in a Tuscan village has never seen a book. She's still stitching clothes by candlelight and believes the world ends at the next valley. The Renaissance, for all its brilliance, isn't for everyone. Not yet. You return to Florence one evening and find a small crowd gathered in a square, watching a street performer recite lines from Dante, his Inferno, where popes roast and traitors freeze. The crowd laughs, gasps, listens. Even the illiterate know the story. You realize that storytelling itself, in books, on walls, on stages, is becoming a kind of power. People are hungry not just for bread, but for meaning. You feel something strange. Hope. It's quiet, like the turning of a page. Tomorrow you'll look back one last time, across all the centuries, all the noise, the plagues, the prayers, the pitchforks. And maybe, just maybe, you'll start to see what it was all for. You stand at the edge of a wind-swept field in northern France, boots heavy with mud, and the weight of 1,000 years pressing down on your shoulders. Behind you lies everything you've seen: castles and cathedrals, crusades and coronations, plagues and presses. In front of you, the world looks familiar but different, cleaner around the edges, more ambitious. Something new is coming, but before it does, you stop, just for a moment, and you look back, because it's time to ask the question that's been quietly tugging at your sleeve since you first stepped into this 1,000-year fever dream. What was it all for? You remember the early days, standing among the shattered statues of Rome's collapse, watching peasants plant seeds under the shadow of forgotten aqueducts. Europe didn't exactly rise from the ashes. It trudged, slowly, often blindly, pulled forward by hunger, faith, and the deeply human refusal to give up. Kingdoms crumbled, rebuilt, rebranded, borders blurred, and somehow, through all the chaos, people kept going. You saw feudalism take root, not because anyone planned it, but because it worked, more or less. Lords offered protection, serfs offered labor. The arrangement was as lopsided as it was unavoidable. You lived in drafty stone castles, gnawed on black bread, and learned fast that loyalty wasn't optional. But even in that rigid world, people dreamed of justice, of heaven, of warmer boots. You fought with knights, marched in crusades, and prayed in cold monasteries where monks illuminated manuscripts by flickering candlelight, not because they expected thanks, but because they believed every letter was a kind of worship. You drank bad ale, saw your first Viking raid, and learned that history wasn't shaped only by kings. It was shaped by fear and famine, storms and stubbornness. You stood in towns where the stench of tannery waste mixed with the scent of fresh bread, and life felt real, raw, loud. You watched guilds rise, towns swell, and merchants turn coin into power. The economy shifted from land to trade, and suddenly, being clever mattered more than being noble. You watched women carve out lives as midwives, weavers, mystics, often invisible, always essential. You saw artists begin to sign their names. You saw heretics burned and saints made, sometimes the same person, depending on who was in charge that year. And always the church, sometimes a beacon, sometimes a bully. You heard Gregorian chants that lifted your soul. You also saw inquisitors in black robes asking questions with knives in their hands. You watched popes anoint emperors and emperors depose popes. And when it all broke in two, when 2, then 3 popes tried to excommunicate each other, you understood that even sacred institutions are made of people. Fallible, petty, political. You lived through the Black Death. You heard the coughing before you saw the bodies. You stood on mass graves. You watched the world flinch and then keep moving. And in the empty fields, you watched wages rise. Not because of generosity, but because there weren't enough people left to exploit. A horror, yes, but also a shift. You followed the peasants when they stood up. You marched beside Wat Tyler, ducked arrows in Flanders, heard the hunger in their chants. They didn't win, but they cracked the foundation, and the lords heard it. You listened to Joan of Arc speak truth to kings. You watched her die, then rise. First as a story, then a symbol, then a saint. And when you stood in the Hagia Sophia and heard it fall silent beneath foreign prayer, you realized no empire is eternal, not even the ones that pretend to be. And then the ideas came, faster, sharper. Gutenberg's press churned out truths and lies in equal measure. But the real revolution wasn't the machine, it was the choice. Who gets to speak? Who gets to read? You saw the beginning of questions that wouldn't be unasked. By the time you reached the Renaissance, you didn't need anyone to explain what was changing. You felt it, in the brush strokes of Botticelli, in the notes of a new kind of music, written for people, not just for God, in the glint of a scalpel as a doctor dares to ask what lies beneath the skin. It wasn't just about reviving the classics. It was about seeing the world and yourself as worth understanding. And here's your final quirky fact. The word medieval didn't even exist until centuries later. The people you met had no idea they were living in the Middle Ages. They weren't stuck between greatness and greatness. They were living, struggling, building cathedrals, farming fields, writing poems about cheese and heartbreak. What felt like a lull to later historians was, to them, everything. And the great scholarly debate, the one that's never really settled, is this. Was the Middle Ages an age of darkness or one of transformation? The truth is, both. For every fire, a forge. For every famine, a feast. For every silence imposed, a voice waiting to be heard. You look back one last time, not just at the buildings and battles, but at the people. The tired farmer, the defiant nun, the apprentice stealing extra ink, the student translating Aristotle by candlelight, the little girl who survived plague and grew up to name her firstborn after a saint she never met. They didn't shape history by knowing they were in it. They shaped it by surviving. And now you, somehow, have survived too. Tomorrow isn't medieval anymore, but it's built on everything you just saw. Take a breath. We made it. You lie down in the tall grass, somewhere quiet between memory and myth, letting the weight of 1,000 years finally slip off your shoulders. The stars above you are the same stars that watched over plague carts, castle sieges, and Renaissance painters, the same ones that twinkled over muddy battlefields and candlelit libraries. But now, here in the dark, everything feels still. You've just wandered through the most misunderstood millennium in human history. The so-called Dark Ages turned out to be not so dark at all. Messy? Absolutely. But rich, complicated, human. It was a time of fractures and fusions, of building new worlds from the ruins of old ones. Empires crumbled, but cities rose. Knowledge was lost, yes, but also preserved, reinvented, translated, expanded. And you didn't just see what they built. You felt what they feared, what they hoped for, what they left behind. You saw belief, raw, dangerous, beautiful. You saw power, not just in kings and bishops, but in peasants, scribes, artisans, and heretics who dared to ask, why not? You saw fire used to warm homes and to burn ideas, but you also saw ink. And ink, it turns out, lasts longer. So as the wind hums through trees once planted to shade forgotten tombs, and the earth cools under your back, take this moment. You earned it. You didn't just learn about medieval Europe. You survived it. Now, if you're still awake, somehow, I hope you're resting easy. And if you've already drifted off, dreaming of longships or cathedral choirs or a sarcastic scribe in a too-tight robe, just know, you made it through the Middle Ages in 2 hours flat. Sweet dreams, time traveler.